It's a privilege to be invited. Thank you, Mike, and wishing everybody a fantastic half day, thinking about worthy thoughts. You have some of the most amazing hero that I worship. David Snowden is one of them, so looking forward to that. What I want you to do is to hold two questions in your head as I go through a very important topic, but yet could be very boring, like professional standard. The two questions I want you to hold in your head or your heart, whatever, is OD discipline, the discipline that you like to grow your career in? And there's no right or wrong answer. And the second question, and in your journey towards mastery, how are you doing? In your journey towards mastery, how are you doing? So what I want to do is to stimulate and evoke some of the thinking in an area that I think is very important. So let's go about what the outline. What I planned for you today is to very briefly tell you about the OD competency journey so far. And the whole thing is, should we pursue this thing called OD standard? And then we kind of go back to a very brief reminder about what is OD, values of OD, and what is your motivation of practice. Then I would take you through 5 sets of reasons meaning current, foundational OD competency, and that will include the CRF one that published in the OD Manifesto. And then think about where are we, the collective community of practitioners in UK, Europe, and USA and the rest of the world, then refocus the role and the value of what OD can offer. Before we start, I would like to do a poll that will give CRF and myself some data. And this polling question, let me go through them. Does the field of OD needs a coherent set of competency and standard? And yes or no. And the second one is, whose primary responsibility is it to develop OD practitioner competence end up with a clear development plan? Should all of us have a ongoing development plan every 12 to 18 months? And what are the top 6 areas of competence that you think that all of us who are in the field, who want to pursue OD as a career and moving towards mastery should have? Now, before Will help us to do the poll, I'd just like to give you a definition, which you all know. So the competency definition, you can approach it in 3 ways. One is a set of personal quality that contribute to the successful performance. So is a set of personal quality that contribute to successful performance. And then you have people like Boeses who actually come along and say, well, it's not just quality, it's the underlying characteristic, of individual that defines successful performance in the field of OD. So this list should delineate who ODP should be and need to be, and what they need to have in their possessions or in their goodies bag. So the third one is basically simply described as the description of what a successful ODP looks like. So that's kind of a rough definition about competency. All right, Will, would you help us to do the poll? Thank you. All right, so we will look forward to compare what you have put into what I will present. So let me quickly take you through the OD competency developmental journey. One can never accuse the field of OD of not being interested in OD competency, because 70 years ago, in 1952, and NTL, which is the founding organization for OD, and the first president is Warner Burke. And they begin to start talking about what is the 7 most important competency. And they start the debate. And later on, Warner Burke went to become the chief exec of ODN USA, and that continued the debate. So I am back to 2021. I hope you have the link of my article. So that took me about 2 years to really go through the research. And there are minimally 45 researcher author suggested what the major contribution to the study of OD competency. And later on, you can see some of the data. And then back into 2018, US ODN, Professional Organization Development Network, has been working. I was part of their board 6 years ago, 5 to 6 years ago, and we begin that debate, and they continue that debate, and they publish about 5 key areas of competency. 2019, CRF actually had the first OD conference and published OD Manifesto, and there's 7 competency. Then 2020, moving forward, published their report. Now, what is moving forward? Moving forward is this group of colleagues in which I'm one of them. And there's a nucleus of us saying that we are old and we are genuinely old in age. What can we pass on to the new generation to stop some of the ongoing debate? So this group grew to 300. Every December in the last 4 years, they met in a hotel in Baltimore, United States. And so they met for 3 years. And at the end of the 3 years, they have a number of subgroups to move their thinking and dialogue forward, and they publish that. And there's a link to this, and you can actually go to see what they have. Now, this is very exciting for me because among those 300, you have the ODs, the founders, the giants on which shoulder we stand on. You have the middle-aged people, you have adolescents, and you have novice. And then you have, basically it's a US group, but you have quite a few, I would say 10% global members. So moving forward, publish that. So that's what I will take you through today. But in spite of that, 70 years on, where are we now? The field does not have any joint agreement across agency, professional institution about what actually constitute and competent ODP. There are a lot of debate whether OD should go down. There are 2 routes. One is certification and standardizing route, and the other route is developmental route. And so what that debate has really split the community. And the reality is few professional organizations, the Canadian ODN, which is one of the most admirable institutions that I admire because they are always a step ahead. And they tried the standardization and certification route. They have done enormous work, but at the end they gave up. And what are some of the reasons that they give up? Well, maybe I go, yeah, what are the reasons behind they give up? And because OD Professional Association don't have the mandate to be a quality assurance professional body. So I work for quite a number of engineering firms because I work in oil industry a lot. And they absolutely, those professional organizations has the mandate to certify what sort of engineer. You can't do deep sea drilling in petroleum unless you have certification. I have a goddaughter who is a petite Chinese woman, and she went to Imperial, studied aerospace, and her first job required her to really pass certain certification before she can really participate in doing the aerospace number of jobs she has. And then later on, she's not interested in aerospace. She moved into deep sea drilling. And can you imagine a 5'2" Chinese petite girl and end up running the whole platform in Angola? And she is the supervisor. But is it easy for her to get there? No, because she has to be certified and quality assured by the professional body before she can become a supervisor of a shift of over 100 people. Now, we don't have that. We don't have that. In fact, the professional association we have often are very weak. They can encourage development, but they can't serve the mandate. The second reasons why we have such a hard time is because the global spread of the field has very different differences in their contextual reality. So the reality of diverse living system in different countries. So I was working with the Filipino group to think about what is that. I went to Shanghai, worked with the Chinese group about what constitute. And some of those things are just very different, not only interpretation of what is competent, but what need to be competent is very different. So we are truly a very diverse field in terms of contextual, cultural situation. Then another one is we have not been able to manage the tension. You would think polarity is right to be there to help us to resolve this tension. Should it be developmental or should it be standardization through certification? Nobody agree. And the field is very diverse and has many specialisms. In my article, I counted minimum 27 specialisms. So like org design, large group intervention, people actually have specialized in service improvement, etc. So specialism rather than the holistic integrity of the field often takes central stage. And so because of that, OD is not in the central stage. And power and politics set up a minefield, particularly in the European and the USA context. Who has the power to tell me whether I'm qualified or not? I have a youngish ODN members, a board member said to me, well, this whole thing is rubbish. Nobody should be able to tell anybody, you know, who are competent or not. Now, those reasons has serious consequences for a field development. And when I was in US teaching, and there are minimum 35 OD development program, PhD program, that you can get certification, not certification, but qualification. And that has been cut down to 9 programs because this continuous debate about what is institutionally well-defined competent ODP has never been resolved. And in the last 6 years, only one new academic program emerged in the United States in the past 5 years, and that's the Bowling Green University by Steve Cady. Anyone want to do a virtual PhD, and that's the place to go. Steve Cady has a very good program. So as Fielding. Fielding used to be in charge by the seashore. And then there are more articles appear to talk about the death and demise of OD, which really pisses me off because the field is never going to die. But because people couldn't handle the disagreement. And what's worrying me is the next one. Lots of amateurist individual or firms offer OD education curriculum. I myself has minimum 5 online learning people approach me and say, we're going to put serious OD development event on. Would you help me to write them? Oh, by the way, we can only do 2-hour slot, and the OD development program is 5 times 2-hour slot. And you can imagine that my answer is no. But in China, whenever I went to Shanghai and do something, there's next things happen that will make you laugh. So if I went there and run the certificate program and the module is called diagnostic, and the next things in the WeChat, a number of the ODP people who attend my program offer an hour teaching on diagnostic at the rate of about equivalent of £10. And they will capture minimum 2,000 ODP to sign up for those. So that is one of the things that worry me, and it's not about being elitist, but it's just like, who is teaching the civil engineer? Who is teaching those people who build bridges so that the bridge don't collapse? Who is teaching, you know, what is the field stand for? And then the last things that make me feel very sad, internal, those of you who have a history being internal OD, you don't have a good time with your client overall. Maybe some of you do, because the internal client have no standard to refer to. and they use whatever standard is in their assumption to judge your performance. So the thing is, who is competent? You might be very competent, but because you're not project-based, you don't act like Booz Allen, and you don't act like McKinsey, you don't act like PwC in project-based transformation program, you are no good. So those are the consequences that worry me and should worry anybody. So should we give up? Absolutely no. Why? Because this field cannot, any field cannot develop without some sort of consistent quality practice base. You know, we don't know what to call these things. Should we call them core competency? The minute you use the word core, people are just get furious. Who are you to define what is core? So just choosing the terminology is a minefield. But right now I stick my neck out and say there are some fundamental competency from research and from some of the gathering of whoever have done some work on competency. Should we call it field standard, or should we just call it credible practice? You know, I am not a wimp, but I'm acting like a wimp in this whole area, because we just need to use language, not to have people kill it off before we actually start. So we need something as a credible guide for curriculum design. You know, CRF is now putting online program, and I would love CRF is using credible criteria, which I'm sure they would. CIPD is already doing that. And are they using the credible standard? I have no comment yet. And ODN, etc. And how many academic program and developer, you know, Rofi Park, Esridge. And so what we need to do is to say, where do developer get their standard in order to make sure the curriculum really help people from novice all the way to seasoned practitioner? And we also need a consistent narrative of what masterful practitioner look like. Can one ever be masterful? Not really, because we are working in a living system field. People are predominantly unpredictable and things do shift. So we need to, but we do need some sort of narrative so that when we use the yardstick in talent management, and I am very, very good in talent management. It seems like I'm bragging, but not. Because I have my eyes on people. When I was a dean in NTL, the Advanced OD Certificate Program, I can tell who has a wonderful future. However, if people want me to justify why I think certain people is perfect for the talent pipeline, certain people need to do some more work, I could not quantify that for you. I can only tell you the intuition that I have. So therefore, we mustn't give up. And then we want organization to take OD professionals seriously. And so we need to help organization to have that. So should we give up? Absolutely not. Now, if I have time, I would stop here and say, what do you think? But can you hold the thing, hold the thoughts you have about what you think? Because later on we can come back to that. But the reality is there's a very treacherous, you know, gap between a lot of wonderful, good intention OD practitioner and good practice. Very good intentional people and having very consistently high quality standard practice is actually not easy to close. Just a reminder of these three things very quickly. So this is from the moving forward. The 300 people meet every December in Baltimore. They came up with this. OD organization is an interdisciplinary field of scholar, educators, and practitioner who work collaboratively with organization and community to develop their system-wide capacity. Now, just that statement constitutes three key characteristics of OD. One is we are a multidisciplinary field. Whichever field tell us why people behave how they behave and how to improve that, and whatever field tell us when people get together in group, in organization, in community, and what happened, and how to actually help those organizations to provide the conditions of success to make people flourish. is a major philosopher talking about when we actually do this field, is our basic concern about making organization, community, help people, help the human nature to flourish. And I was very taken by that. I begin to judge my work as, am I doing something to make the human spirit flourish? And so that's the second one. That's the first one. The second one is our work is always marked by collaborative. We never kind of flaunt our expertise. Of course, we are expert because some of us have master's degree, PhD degree, and 30 years of practice, but we don't flaunt them because we believe the wisdom resides in the system member. And our job is to make sure processes are set up to help those system member to do action research, to research into their own situation so that they go, aha, that's the data, that's our organization, then they can move into mobilize action phase. And so our job in ODP is to help the system member to reveal itself to itself. And the third characteristic, we are always system perspective. We are guided by system theory in all its guise so that we can continue to help the system-wide growing. And our aim, our purpose of our field is really to produce and help to build healthy and effective organization communities. And our basic source of wisdom are drawn from organization study, applied behavioral science. So that is OD. And moving on, also specify the OD value. Now, nobody need to agree, but about this 9 thing. But the thing that we all need to agree is OD as a field is quite slippery slope, because the more you know about human nature, the more you and I can be savvy in manipulating people behavior. And there are good manipulation, integral manipulation, and there are toxic manipulation. And by the way, I don't know whether you know, recently I thought all the people who drawn into OD has a little shadow side within us. We actually quite like to have a control over human behavior. And that is something that's hard to really admit. But we like to see what we can do with our magic hand and our magic wand in terms of guiding human behavior. So we need something to hold us accountable. And so continuous learning is important. Building trust and respect and demonstrate what that is. We are always committed to client growth and development rather than their dependency on our expertise. We are ever into diversity, equality, and equity, collaborative, and we also need to own we are not using tools and methodology per se. Every time when we stand in front of a client here and now, it is us who are the instrument. And this instrument, whether it's faulty or strong or healthy, it is in our hand. Therefore, continuous learning is important. And so those are the OD value. And the vision of the field, according to moving forward, is actually very visionary and touching. But this is very much in American cheesy, complicated language. But when you get this slide pack, you can actually substitute with something. But the field is a key field to help society maintain civil society. You know, we are democratic based. We believe in the value of human being. We believe every individual should be able to create and to be able to adapt, to stay resilient and continue to thrive. During pandemic, we have to really switch our way of working. How do you help organization come out from the rut? We need to help people to have the sustainable capability to create and lead healthy organization. And we need to really focus on leaders and how do we continue to help them to be owning the leadership and the responsibility to grow those environments. So I'm not going to linger on here, but OD is an inspiring field. I come across OD when I was 16, and I never regret about what this field has. I feel my value congruency is spot on. I am committed to ensure, within our drop in the ocean, every drop in the ocean is worth investing to make sure autocratic leadership is not going to be there. We need to look at, in a community level, political dominance that will diminish the flourishing of its citizen is not there. But anyway, that is why the field is so exciting. Ooh, that sounds like a sermon, isn't it? It's not very good when I preach because it's like evangelical. OD specialism, there are many of them, and there are, well, this is just a few for you to think about. Now, I am primarily a big system transformation specialist. 98% of my work is to help big organization to really think through how they go from one to B. So right now, my current portfolio is to help a number of big pharma to really make major transformation. I'm supervising the whole global change team. And so that's what I do. I'm lousy as a team builder. I'm totally impatient as a coach because I want people just to grow up and behave. So I'm a lousy coach. I'm a lousy everything, but I am a very, very good, strong, global, complex organization change specialist. But because of that, you and I will know that some of the specialism, we have to have a taste of it. I need to know about 18. I need to know about group dynamics things. I need to know about, the diversity and inclusion and equity work. I need to have a nose to smell it. I need to know that in the backdrop of my work, I need to know enough about what is organization health and how do we make sure development is synonymous, any change is synonymous with development. So at the end of the change, organization becomes stronger, fitter. When you get this slide, I'd like you to really start the specialism that make your heart sing. Well, none of us, if I have to do team building, my heart would just break. If I have to do coaching, I would just not be able to get up in the morning. Everybody has different level of system motivation work. So kind of find out which are the level of system work that you love, and then that home in, and that's where your development is in specialism. But you also need to start those areas that will help your primary specialism to be even stronger, because those are the area of competence. So now quickly, I take you through 5 foundational competence. Now, these people don't use those words. They use core, they use other word. So the USA competency framework by ODN, they call it the global competency. And so they choose 5 areas. 5 areas is business advisor. Underneath that, they have strategic catalyst, result-oriented, and trusted advisor. They put credible strategist. It is credible influencer and collaborative communicator and global diverse integrator. And informed consultant, they are exemplary in what they know. They are also emotional intelligent. They are system change specialists. They use system perspective and to support the change process. In the process, are very good in culture building and innovation. And efficient designer, system designer, process consultation. So what this group has is they fulfill one of the biggest criticism CRF and Mike has about OD, which is a lot of OD specialists do not have a wide breadth of knowledge so that they can actually be very comfortable under their skin and talk about a number of issues with clients. And another critical comment from Mike and from CRF is we're not strategically business savvy, contextually savvy. We don't know the oil price. So when I was working with oil, I need to read the oil petroleum journey and daily release about what is the trading price of oil. To go from 15 US dollars a barrel to 35, drop down to 5, because those trading figure has huge implication on the organization. If they trade too high, they have surplus profit, and they need a strategy to use those surplus for something else. And so the whole organization swing in. If it dropped down to 5, they have to have dealing with the scenario. That's why Shell is the first group of people that use scenario planning. So being business advisor, you can't advise unless you actually know the business. So whatever sector you work in, go and study that sector, know the history, know is the ups and downs of that, because that's part of a collaborative. And the designer aspect is really about addressing the consultancy cycle. You know, as you as a consultant, not only you need to be good at diagnosis, but not by yourself as an expert, but using system member to do with that with you. And then after that, what sort of design of intervention? And the other one is moving forward. Yeah, this 300 people just published. They put about six key areas. They are very big on system thinking. And if you need to learn one theory in OD, you have to learn system thinking, because that's no other way for us to operate credibly without us knowing it. But this group not only put number 1, they put number 4, theory-based. They really we need to understand, apply, and develop. Now, a lot of novice ODP would come and argue with me and say, why do we need? I'm skilled enough, I have all these toolkits. Well, not until they get in front of a group. They have done their design, they get in front of a group, and the group reject their design and say, well, that won't work. And right then, here now, you need to stand in front of people and completely redo your program, your design. You couldn't do that unless you go back to the fundamental. Well, what is this? And what does that look like? And I think I talked about this experience once with CRF people. I was leading a German pharmaceutical company on a global change. Every 3 months, we bring them in. There's about 60 people in about 7 or 8 tables. And I and the internal team planned something beautifully for that 3 days. And within the first hour, after the first hour, I said to them, this is what we will do, blah, blah, blah. And one of the 6'4" German guys stood up, called Hans. And Hans say, Mee-Yan, you'd completely underwhelmed me. Tell me what you're going to do differently. If not, I and my team are walking out. You know, I don't know whether you ever come across this. I don't know. I always get that. You know, so I then kind of steady myself and depersonalize the attack. By the way, when you're attacked by a client, depersonalize. They don't know you well enough, and they did not wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to humiliate the OD person. They didn't do that. So I calm down and say, what's the issues? Can I get a group agreement, Hans, for you to have 10 minutes to tell us what's so underwhelming and what is the dissatisfaction? And basically it's a power dynamic issue. If in doubt, give them a coffee break. During the coffee break, the team that I designed with were shaking. I was shaking. But I have to have a personal persona, not shake so much. So we completely redesign after coffee to lunch. That's all we have. And I need to draw on theory, social constructionism, and dialogical theory. What are the language we are using that really are not bringing them together? What is the system thinking? Why is the system so split? So social constructionism theory, system theory, dialogical theory, and chaos, you know, and complexity, and Glenda's stuff comes in, and David Snowden stuff come in, and we begin to redesign the whole thing. And that is why theory is so important. In here, inclusion and equity is very important, because a human being has the natural tendency to stratify human value by skin color, by birth order, by gender, by sexuality, by all sorts of things. And however, in the Shell platform, they are 100% white men. And even among the white men, people stratify who is the Oxford graduate and who are the people who only go to Polytechnic at that time. So we have enormous ability within organization to stratify human value. And ODP is the people who say, well, if you do that, nobody flourish. And then future focus is we always have to have an eye, and that means we have the capability to be future ready. And of course, self-awareness is really important, because it is so easy for this instrument to have unresolved issue and project and transfer our unresolved stuff to the system and the people we work with. And the CRF one, very similar to the other. Being business savvy is very important. And I don't think I misquote you, Mike, that you think that if ODP don't have that, they don't have that. They don't have credibility. And Mike, you're also very big on number 3, mastery and of the breadth of the domains, and then which then will give personal credibility. And because we are organizationally savvy and because we are a critical friend to leaders, so we need to work on courage and bravery. And I think you repeat yourself again from 1 and 3 to 6, which is fostering breadth of view about multiple idea, which I really like, and enabling, encourage other people, and of course, systemic thinking. And then this one is national government, the Institute of Leadership and OD belong to a national government. And this is one of the most advanced national government list of competencies I have seen. So the use of self, the human dynamics, diagnosis and feedback, intervention, selection, design and review, change management. Now, this is interesting. This is the first one where change management become a new label, and organization design, which is a specialism, and strategic and system awareness. So that is from a national government who have invested a lot of money in OD and set up their own in-house Institute of Leadership and Development. And then the final one is what I found out from the 45 pieces of research, and it's much more than that, but these are the critical ones, and theory-based and knowledge of behavioral science and system thinking. And so every piece of literature I talk about is really about system thinking. I'm looking at my time. I'm getting there. So, but I need about 5 or 7 minutes. So system thinking, working with diversity, these are the most common competency gone through the 70 years of research. And so in some sense it's timeless. Timeless meaning they all show up in these research as important. And managing the consultancy process with skill, knowledge, and presence is a new one from the other one. New one meaning it didn't show up in the other one in such specific term. Relationship with others are very important, and relationship with self is very important. Strong group processes, know how to work and support complex change, and living out their ethics and values. That again is not mentioned in some other one. It's not right or wrong. It's just I observed that it's not there. And competency in kind of OD work and in culture work and lifelong learning. So when you put those things together, you could, when you do that, you can see that are there enough similarity? Well, I did this so that I can answer my question. Well, there are quite a lot of similarity, theory-based, theory-based, theory-based. That's very important. System thinking, system thinking, system thinking. Managing the consultancy process. In moving OD, they specialize on skillful intervention. And in CRF, looking at courage and being organizationally savvy. And in OD USA, looking at effective designer. And in the Institute of Leadership, talking about diagnosis. And then there's some gap in between. Now that lead me to begin to think, is it ever possible to have a united list of things? Well, yes and no. Yes, because if you unpack behind what is, they are incredibly similar, but the usage of language is different. So, but is it possible then with such OD specialism, such a wide range, is it possible to have certification on something? Well, that would be more difficult. So I don't have time for this, but when you actually get this pack of slides, spend some time with people you know and go through those slides and kind of do an evaluation of yourself and the community you belong to and see how savvy you are as a group, as a collective, as a community on those competencies. So moving towards the end, I think it is so important, just like in any field, we need to move towards mastery. So first of all, you need to get to know yourself. What makes your heart sing? Yesterday, I spent 6 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. helping Singapore to recruit the highest rank OD person. And my first question is, what makes your heart sing? What level of work that make you sing in your heart, and what's give you joy? So I think you need to know that. Now, of course, we all need to do something we don't have joyful feeling about because that's part of the package. But knowing your motivation is really important and your calling. And that means you need to design what level of system work that give you joy. And I was sharing with you myself, I'm right now in a very tough transitional space because I can't travel because of my medical condition. I no longer can do the portfolio work that give my heart sing, the large scale macro system work. So I need to redefine and say what it is. And so that required me to draw up a personal competency profile. I'm doing that myself and support from others. And I have 3 particular important coach in my life right now. A Jewish woman rabbi in New York helped me to look at the whole process of aging, saging, and how to harvest my experience and my gifts at this late age. I have a spiritual director in North Carolina help me to rethink about my calling. And I have an OD transitional coach with me to say, now that I can't do what I love doing, what else are left for me? So based on those, I need to form a development plan, pursue it. Even at the age of 60 something, I need to aim for mastery for the next round of work that I will concentrate in. Then really regularly for you to review your state of practice and your aspire mastery plan. When you're ready, kind of ask people to give you feedback so that you can continue that lifelong learning. Is there a possible way to move the field forward? Yes, but it's very tough. In here, professional organizations need to get together. Right now, professional organizations are not getting together to really, for the sake of the community, to work through their difference and to have a joint up competency profile. So I decided to do something that later on, maybe Mike will agree to send to the members to test. I am now working with an app and a web app developer, putting some of these a la carte menu into a app and a web app that can help you to construct your personal competency profile, and then for you to self-assess, and then for you to do personal development plan. The web will be launched for testing in late August. So if you are willing to do that, and with permission from Mike, we can send that to you. I want to end with this Ed Shine's comment. Back in 2006, he was asked, is OD a viable field of study that will make a difference in the way we live and run organization? And this is his answer. I just love this answer. He said, to answer this question, I must, or we must, recognize that how many elements of OD have evolved into organizational routines that are nowadays taken for granted, like better communication, team building, management of intergroup relationship, conflict, change management, survey work, conflict resolution, social technical system, building intergroup relation, just to name a few. At the same time, the field is continue to grow in defining concepts and tools to tackle the even tougher problems of change and organization dynamics. And he continued to say that in the increasing global, diverse, complex world, organization development will continue to flourish as a field because its practitioners are unique. That means you and me are unique in our concern for human processes. Are you concerned with human process? I'm obsessed about human processes. You know, I look at the human processes and know the impact it has on the people I work with. I want you to be obsessed about that, because at Shine say our value is based on whether our obsession is there. OD practitioners have learned as a core part of our training that process is just as important as content. Process between individual groups, intergroup level, is what ODP understand and can improve. And so, and finally, he say, you know, OD is a field that provide that broad area of intellectual resources and tools to improve organization functioning and maintain civil society. So I think all of us need to begin to aspire to be remarkable, because it is a field, it's a privilege to be in this field. And I want you to look at Emerson quote, what lies behind us and what lies before us are very small matter compared to what lie within us. Because of who we are, we continue to transform individual. I want you to recall those amazing moments when people walk up to you, and many of you, all of you should have those experiences that, you know, James or Jane, thank you for doing that. That really changed my way of thinking. That really helped me to move forward. I want you to be greedy about that experience, because what's within us will change what within people and within organization. So go well, go strong, and have a great conference. And my vision for you, and be that one person that that to the world. Okay. Over to you, Rupert.
Thank you so much, Mee-Yan. I don't think we have a huge amount of time for questions. Unfortunately, we have about 7 minutes or so. If I could start with one, I can see the difficulty of trying to get a large group of people who are diverse to agree on a taxonomy of competencies and what those proficiency levels are, and the battle. Have you done much to say, you know what, I'm just going to go with it, here is a list, here are a list of roles, here are a list of targets, and actually try and operationalize that?
Yes, and fail because of all the reasons that I named. So the web app I'm developing is, I will list the foundational OD competency. I will list, I have asked a number of contributors to list the OD specialism competency. It's kind of like the restaurant menu. I always talk about, I've been eating so much Chinese takeaway, so that's, in the Chinese takeaway menu, you have meats, you have this,
Yep.
and you tick those.
Yep.
And the first thing is you need to know who you are and your calling. And then you need to say, I want to run towards mastery in this. And you do conceptually tick. When the web come out, you tick those areas that will help you to run towards mastery. And once you develop that, then you go find a development coach, a peer, or whatever, to use what you personally construct, which nobody imposed on you, to evaluate, self-assess yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Am I sufficiently in this? And after you do that process, which is self-initiated, self in control, then you, with somebody else, help development coach to do your development plan. And I think a development plan up to 18 months is a really good thing. We never do all the thing, but at least it's guide us towards that. And I think getting organization to agree a set is going to be difficult, because all of us are power hungry. All of us, all human beings are power hungry. We have a sense of agency. We do not want people to tell us, you need to be certified. If you are building bridges, you will submit to that, but we're not building bridges. So that's my answer.
So what you're saying is let the individual practitioner define for themselves from the Chinese menu of competencies, self-assess practically, and then have a coach to help execute against that development plan.
Yes, and that's the polarity, using the polarity. I really work through polarity on this issue. I think that's currently is the best design. So, because if nobody even know what competency, hopefully when you visit the web app, you see the range, you be educated.
Yeah.
That OD is a field that are full of wonderful standard. that help us in doing OD. We become better. So I want an education element of the web app. And by the way, I'm only the front runner of this. I bet the minute I launch this, individual institution will then go into competitive mode and want to do their own thing. And hallelujah, that is the movement that I want.
Yeah, be the kindling. Yes.
Can I jump in there? Because, hi Mee-Yan.
Hi, Karen.
So I joined a university a year ago in the HR department. Actually, one of the underpinning things which Jan's talking about, so to study higher education, which is the sector I've gone into, actually the values of academia are completely countercultural to OD values. And that is part of our challenge, because within academic fields in the UK, globally, actually we set up academics to compete with each other. Their reward systems lead them to compete to each other. And they need to become more specialists to succeed. And that's almost the opposite of what we want from OD. As you said, Mee-Yan, OD needs to be multidisciplinary, and that is not valued in academia. And so that's part of the other underpinning challenge that institutions have to bring forward OD as a meta field, because it's not valued in the very institutions that are teaching it. I think the other thing which I've got a question for you, Mee-Yan, is around the rise of change practitioners. So for the first time in many years, I've been recruiting or attempting to recruit OD practitioners. And I get 60, 70 applications, which on paper look very good. Most people have change practitioners in their job title. I then bring them to interview and I'm deeply disappointed. And I've now been out 3 times to the market and failed to appoint. And I'm interested in your view on change practitioners as an emerging field.
Well, Linda Atkinson, a very, very powerful woman, but may have lost her reputation because she's old. Those of us who old slowly disappear. Linda Anderson Ackerman said that, change specialism is worth to be a specialism, and I think it is. However, that's as you know, there are 2 ways to do change, well, many ways. One is really stick to the OD principle, which is participation and collaboration and co-construction, taking people matter seriously, but without neglecting the backroom work. The front room work is really creating those experience, sense-making journey, because people don't actually make sense, et cetera, et cetera. The back room is your Deloitte, PwC experience, project base, and which is very important. So right now, the group I supervise in a pharma, the net worth value of change is £9 billion, right? Now you have to have your backroom people actually cultivate, looking at the budget, looking at this and monitor, and the risk, mitigation of risk, all those are important. And what we need in the OD field is to merge those 2, that strongly holding on the OD value, and as well as know enough about the backroom change, and don't laugh at the backroom change people, because I come to respect. But what the knee-jerk reaction we have is we poo-poo the backroom people. So yesterday in Singapore government, the highest rank of OD people, the best candidate they put before me is from Deloitte, very, very specialized in change management, exactly the way you talk about that, Karen. But what he can't tell me how the OD principle can be integrated and be used. He cannot give me one single example. He cannot. I mean, basically, he doesn't even heard of the term use of self. And he doesn't even heard of David Snowden work. He hasn't heard Glenda Yowan's work on HSD. So our job is to, so at the end, we say, is he appointable? Well, he is appointable because that sort of people who earn a lot of money, willing to kind of scale down work for public sector are rare. But it needs a very strong development induction program on OD. So that is what I'm thinking. How do we hold the polarity? Backroom work is important. Front room work, if you don't do it, there's no sustainability. So how do we actually combine the two?
I think we've got time for one more question, if we can, Melissa.
I was keen to just to bring into those in the room and speakers some of the points that we've been discussing as Mee-Yan's been talking on the online chat. I think we've seen so many of the competencies that are so important for OD professionals, but there was some chat about what is the difference between what out of these are characteristics and what are competencies, and therefore what are innate and what are actually developable. And so therefore, also remembering that the context of your organization and your industry is everything. So getting a mix of these characteristics and competencies within your OD team and getting that balance correct is really, really crucial.
Fantastic. I think, given the time, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Mee-Yan, it was fantastic. Thank you so much. And you'll be with us, Mee-Yan. I can hear and feel your energy. And you made reference to your age, I don't know how many times, but you're going to be with us for a very, very long time, because with this energy and everything else, and you will change this space, there's no question. So I have confidence, and thank you. You talked about honesty and bravery, and I think you exemplified that as well. So a big thank you. I know there's lots of smiles in the room here. We'll have a 5-minute break, and then we'll move on to the next session. So for those online, at 8 minutes past the hour, we will start again. To get to know Joe. Joe is the Innovation Fellow and a leading expert in corporate finance and strategy. And Joe, it looks like you've done a huge amount of education. You've won lots of awards for teaching and run over 2,000 executive teaching days. So and written numerous articles in your field for magazines like Dialogue, CFO, and Fortune. So very illustrious. I've seen you present before. This is going to be engaging, and we're going to talk about agile and flexibility and speed, all very apt for the age we're in. So with no further ado, Professor Joe Perfetti.
Great, and thank you for that. I will say that I know we have a Q&A session scheduled at the end, but if there are any inline questions, feel free to ask them, either Rupert or in the room or somebody on Zoom. And I just want to add one other thing to my CV. As of February this year, I also have a third job, which is I am the CFO, interim CFO for a healthcare organization, small $350 million company. I was helping them do an acquisition, and as part of that, they're like, "Hey, can you take over the CFO role until we figure this out?" So I've actually been attempting to apply some of the Zoom principle or the Agile principles that we've been talking about as well in the business context, as opposed to just working with firms at a consulting role. But part of what I want to talk about is the Agile dashboard, and I'm happy to be here again. Been part of a couple of different sessions, and I know our time is limited, so I am going to just jump right in. You will have a copy of all this material in the slides, and if you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to me after as well. I just want to start out with the first concept, which is I've been talking for several years about the need for what I call the Agile dashboard. And I want you to understand that when I use that term throughout this session today, it really means two things. It is both an actual dashboard as well as a metaphor. And really a lot of what the Agile dashboard is about is in today's increasingly complex, uncertain world, leaders have to start looking and companies have to start looking more forward-looking. As a matter of fact, I always like to say that's the biggest difference between finance and accounting. Accountants look backwards. They're scorekeepers. Finance people are about the future. We deal with the uncertainties. We deal with the scenarios, the probabilities. But the future is far more important. And so we have to have a mindset to look forward. We also have to have tools and metrics that are more forward-looking. Because I also like to say that when I'm an innovation fellow at Duke, and when I started the research on the Agile dashboard, we started with the premise of this quote, which has guided me for the last several years, which Jack Welch at GE predicted his own company's demise. And he had a clinic of an annual report, one of his last annual reports ever at GE. And the point is, we started to recognize that agility is about systems thinking. There's three systems. There's a market system, there's a human system, and there's an organizational system. They're all moving, but the market system is often moving faster than you are. And as organizations, if we can't keep up, then we are not going to be successful. I mean, if you look at the work of late Clay Christensen and his firm Insight, in the United States, by the year 2025, we're losing half the S&P 500 every 12 years. And it's not just companies going out of business, it's disruption. And what's driving this disruption is constant innovation and change. It's harder for leaders to keep up. And what I like to say is you can't drive a car looking in the rearview mirror. And that's the problem in most of our metrics. Our metrics are backward looking. What did we generate in revenue and profit and sales and turnover? All of that is historical data. And we'd love to keep score, but it's almost like when you think about a football match, it doesn't matter what your record is. Who's going to win that next game? How do I understand about what happens in the future? That's what is more and more important. And that is what we're trying to train leaders to be able to do. So the other side of the Agile dashboard is we came up with a framework to think about the future. And if anybody comes up with a better marketing acronym for this, I'm happy to take your content, but we call it SUD. And it stands for Scan, Understand, Discern, and Decide. And these are the 4 actions that you need to take as part of creating a dashboard. And it's just very obvious as you walk through these. First thing is, what are you doing to scan the external environment? What are my sensors out there? And the sensors have to be not things like, for example, when you look at your competitors, it's not the competitors that you think they are. So for example, it's not your traditional competitors, it's the startups. It's in health, it's the health technology companies that I'm more worried about that are the startups, not the big health players that you normally compete with. What is that type of environment, and what are some of those weak signals that are happening? But here's the other thing. Even if we're scanning that external environment, can we understand what we see? And can we separate out what is a true signal and what is something that's going to change in the environment? And that's a skill set that we have to develop as organizations. And it's an iterative loop that we have to keep going through. The other side of this is discern and decide. Even when organizations can understand that there's a change happening, can they create the options? Can they build flexibility into what they do? Can they discern? That's actually, if you look up the definition, discerning, what it's all about. And then can you act? Can you actually make that decision under uncertainty? And so many organizations are paralyzed by the fear of the inability to act. And so when we look at agility, these become the very important muscles that we have to put into place and the metrics that we have to measure. So with that in mind, we started to look at what kind of metrics can we look at. And there's really 3 that have been developed relative to what we call business agility. So one of the metrics that we're going to talk about today is speed. And speed is about how fast your organization can move. Now, again, I'll mention a cautionary tale. Don't be Boeing, right? Boeing was reckless with some of their speed, and it's devastated people individually. A lot of people died. And if you think about the 737 MAX crisis, but nonetheless, we have to find ways to move faster and work smarter. Secondly, it's that interaction. It's that SUD framework. It's understanding that we're in a system and the system is moving and there are multiple parts of the system. And are we measuring the system? And more importantly, are we looking more future orientation as opposed to just looking past? And the third element of the Agile dashboard is what I like to call pivot. And I separated this out. And we had some talk amongst this originally with the academic side. But the point is, and I'll use a sports metaphor, you may know what you need to do in terms of the play. You might even be a great individual performer and you can make the move that you think is going to actually win you the game. But the point is, can you actually execute? Can you pull it off? Can you actually run that play? And that's the other side of the Agile dashboard, is it's a capability conversation. And increasingly as an organization, it's know thyself. We have to understand that execution is so critically important. I like to say as part of our research that the godfather of industry analysis, his name is Michael Porter, and all the research in industry analysis really goes back to 1984 in his original book. As a matter of fact, he had a very high-end consulting firm that was basically, you were paying him millions of dollars to basically help you figure out what industries to go in. And it was interesting as that firm went bankrupt in 2013. The guy who invented industry analysis was advising some of the most important CEOs and boards on how to do this. And his firm went belly up. And the reason why is because selecting the good market is only half the battle. Companies were getting into markets they didn't know what they were doing. And it goes back to this capability conversation. Matter of fact, I didn't add this to the slide to the deck, but there's some research from Bain, which I really like, that says if you go into a market that you're trying to grow into, it's a new market, it's about a 1 in 3 chance of financial success. Growth is actually hard, the data says over time. But if you go into a market without capability, your odds of financial success drop to 1 in 20. So back to the Agile dashboard. What are your capabilities and how are you acquiring them? So this came from sports, which is basically where the metaphors started to play out. Now, the other thing that started to happen as we started looking at the Agile dashboard is how strategy is changing. And I know usually I refer to, there's a guy named Dave Snowden. He's got a great TED Talk video and you should listen to it. The nice thing is he's here live. And I know I can't do justice to his framework, but one of the insights that I really like, and I've oversimplified it, probably not doing a good job of it over the years, but basically to understand that when you deal with the future and you deal with strategy, that I look at it on a very simple level is the strategic world is moving from what I call complicated to complex. And when I talk to leaders, I like to say, look, complicated is like the Queen's Gambit, right? Basically, it's chess. You can outthink your opponent. You're Walmart. You're basically going into online grocery delivery to compete with Amazon. That's a complicated decision and it's very solvable. And the more effort you put into it, you could probably work out a better solution for that. But increasingly, what we're doing is we're facing complex challenges. And I like to say complex challenges are like poker. And the point is, you can do all the analysis in the world, but you're going to have to make a bet before you see that next card. And when that next card is played, all the odds are going to change. And everything that you thought was true is suddenly going to be different. And part of what happens in a complex world is you have to act. And it's counterintuitive to organizations because it's anti-agile in a way, because people want to basically know before they act. And now what we have to do is we have to make that leap. We have to act before we know. As a matter of fact, a lot of this is now coming out of how scientists, computer scientists, apply technology, meaning the traditional definition of strategy is kind of like the algorithm. I create the algorithm, I feed it with data, and it cranks out a solution. And if I can get a better algorithm, I'm going to have a better solution. But the problem is in today's world, in complex environments, we don't know the algorithm. That's the whole point of machine learning. What you do is you suck up as much data as you can, and basically you look at the data and the algorithm comes from that data. It emerges, it's emergent. And that's what organizations are struggling with, because sometimes you actually have to have strategy that's emergent. You don't know what's going to happen. And that's why we have to start to understand what type of environment we're in when we're making these decisions. Part of the Agile dashboard is understanding how we deal with complexity, because the problem is we use the past to help us make sense of the future. And so that's why sense-making frameworks become so important. But the problem is what happens when you can't fit what you see into that future sense-making framework? How do you act? And that's why when we respond to complexity in an agile way, it becomes about flexibility. And so depending on the type of environment, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you're going to hear Dave Snowden himself talk about this later. You make different types of decisions. But the point is, when you're in complex environments that are rapidly changing, which is the world today, we need to do a lot more testing and learning. And so when I work with Google, they call it failing well, right? It's not failing fast, it's failing well. And the whole point of failing well is you learn, because that's the point, is the people who are making those mistakes, they're gaining knowledge, they're gaining information. And that is the next source of competitive advantage. Because if I have the knowledge that you don't, I'm going to make better decisions. And if I can incorporate that back into my organization faster, I'm going to win that race over the long period of time. How do I make sure I'm incorporating it? That's why I need an Agile dashboard. Because ultimately, it's about managing risk. And risk is uncertainty. Remember, risk is not about losing money. If you lose money as an organization, that's not risky. Because if you thought you were going to lose money and you lost money, there's no risk to that. If you thought you were going to lose money and you made money, what do you mean you made money? You said you were going to lose money. So that's the point. Risk is surprise. Risk is standard deviation. It's the range of outcomes. That's the risk. So the point is, when we're faced with a wide range of outcomes, what do? Mathematics can give us some insight. When you look at Black-Scholes, which is the standard option pricing model, believe it or not, to price an option, you don't need the ROI. What actually matters in the price of any option is the standard deviation. Tell me the range of outcomes, and I'll tell you how much options are going to cost. Options are very valuable when you don't know what happens. That's the point. We have to understand that in the context of the strategic world. When we don't know what's going to happen, we need optionality. We need flexibility. When we know what's going to happen, we don't need options. Just go make a decision. So that's the point. As organizations, that's straightforward. But when you're faced with those decisions simultaneously, we start to get paralyzed. And the other problem is we don't like to fail, right? And that's the point. We have to reframe and redefine what making mistakes are. Matter of fact, Duckworth, if you read Grit, has some really good examples of how to think about failure. Because what she says is basically there's 3 levels of goals. And if you're going towards your high level goal, which she calls purpose, basically that's a good failure because you're trying things out that's actually helping what the organization wants to do. Whereas if you're failing at a low level goal, that's actually bad failure, right? Because those aren't the types of failures that are going to be acceptable at an organizational level. But that's the point. I'm a CFO. I understand that ROI means restriction on investment. And early stage projects can't be measured purely on financial terms because ultimately we'll never do early stage projects. And that's another problem. So that's the point. We're going to have to try things out. But when I work with United Airlines, they have a new CEO who's been there for about a year, Scott Kirby. And what's interesting is how much innovation they're doing when they're on the verge of insolvency. Yet they're still driving innovation to try and come back stronger in the marketplace. It's really kind of an amazing story of what they're doing there. But the point is, what I really like that he said to his leaders is he said, look, I don't care if you go and fail. What I want you to do is I want you to be honest. I want you to be honest with yourself to say, you know what, this isn't working, learn from it and move on. He said, if you do that, we're going to be successful. And I'm never going to stop you from going out there and trying new things. He said, the problem is when you're not honest with yourself. And these organizational initiatives have like, and everybody's like congratulating and patting themselves on the back. They're like these zombie things that won't fail. Like those are the types of failures that just keep on going. And that's when it really hurts the organization's ability to try new things. So what do you do when you lack information? Well, Colin Powell originally developed this. Jeff Bezos at Amazon has put this into ethos. But Colin Powell called it the 40-70 rule. And you notice that doesn't add up to 100%. But the point is, we can't act without information. We need at least 40% of the data to make a decision. All right. Otherwise, you're just shooting from the hip. And that's poor ways to be a leader. So you need data, you need some evidence. But the problem is, you can't wait for 90%. Because 90% is like waiting for Godot. You're going to take forever to make that decision. And so you have to be prepared as an organization to go at 70%. And again, that's Jeff Bezos' ethos. Go at 70%. Are we going to make mistakes? Yes. Don't kill the company with anything big, but learn. And most importantly, adapt. It goes back to the whole idea of agility, is that you have to continue to act and adapt and learn. And as long as you do that, you keep making good decisions with 70%, you're going to surge forward and win. And so it's interesting that I was sitting at a Harvard session with the CFO of Walmart. His name was Brett Biggs. I was talking to him. I happened to be sitting next to him. I was talking to him about Amazon. He's like, you know, Joe, Amazon's getting to the point where they're getting so big that they're going to struggle and they're not going to make it. We went through this at Walmart and they're about to hit the wall. And you know what? Amazon still hasn't hit that wall. And I think the reason why is because of the difference in cultures. And the cultures are completely different. Walmart's a very much command and control culture. Amazon is not. And I think that's one of the things that's allowed them to surge ahead. Now, don't get me wrong, Jeff Bezos is all about the data. and they use data to make decisions. And they basically test and learn a lot. But I guess that's the other side of it, which is they're making mistakes, but they're going back stronger, and they're not letting the mistakes deter them from learning and then searching forward. So what does this mean to you as a leader? It means three things. Your role as leaders and the leaders that we put into our organizations are changing. Increasingly, it's a lot less about direction. It's about setting context, right? And then the next part is about transparency, because the way that work is happening in our organization is changing. The organizational unit used to be basically the business unit. Now it's the team. So as a leader, I can't direct that team because also it's got to be close to the work doing by the customer. So if I want my people to do the same thing that I do, to make those decisions without having to command and control them, I spend all my time giving them context, because that's the only way that they're going to make the same decision I made. But the part that people often forget is transparency, because if they don't have the same data that you do, there's no way they can make the same decision that you can. So you have to be far more transparent than you've ever been. And I increasingly think that clarity matters. This corporate speak gets in the way of decisions all the time. We so much fine tune our presentations that people don't know what the hell we're talking about. Clarity, simple language, easy to understand. And as leaders, we have to be enablers. I also call them agility architects. If you're going to build an agility architecture organization, and I'm finding this in my own healthcare company, you need a single source of truth. Everybody's got to be looking at the same data to know that that is the right piece of information. If you don't have that, you'll never be agile. You got to have common definitions for things. You got to basically, and this is the part that's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, stability drives flexibility. If you try and be flexible and you're not a stable system, you end up with chaos. So believe it or not, the road to flexibility, stable process, because, and this is also why we get into anti-fragility and resilience, because ultimately, and not to want to quote Sylvester Stallone, but it's the Rocky Balboa in this quote says, you know, you're going to get hit. It's not whether you got hit and fall down, it's can you get up and keep going? And so the other part of this is when you get hit, could your organization keep going on with those processes? And that's why culture is so important. Align incentives become so important to agile cultures, especially if you're going to make mistakes in an uncertain world. I also think I wrote an article on how a CFO has to do different things. And now I'm actually living that, because basically, and this is some work I also did with Scott Walker, who's currently the CFO of Aetna, part of CVS Health in the United States. But basically, we have to start looking at financial information differently. It's more about business KPIs than financial results. Planning is now switching from the 3 and 5 year plan, which is going to be outdated, to increasingly, it's about constantly developing scenarios and thinking through options for our organization. Again, the communication is about community context. And the most important thing is CFOs have to start managing capabilities. So that's the point. If we're managing the value of organizations, capabilities are one of the most important values that our organizations have in this world that we're going to go forward in, particularly with uncertainty. And risk management is about helping the organization deal with that uncertainty. It's not about just mitigating risk and assigning contracts. It's about helping deal with the unknown. And increasingly, human capital is capital, and it's part of our value creation. I can't tell you how many more meetings I'm now involved in with people and talent, is the name of what we call our HR in our organization, about managing human capital, because that is so important. And we have to not be afraid of digital, because digital is a force multiplier to what we do. And most importantly, finance can't be Dr. No. We have to look for ways to say yes, particularly with these early stage investments. Otherwise, we're going to stifle the innovation itself. And that is just counterintuitive to the way that we've traditionally run our businesses. But that's what agility needs. So one of the final aspects, I know we're going to open this up for Q&A, and also have an exercise we can do. But I talked about the 3 metrics of agility. And one of the ones that I've started out with is, and I'll just keep it simple today, how do you measure speed? Because I think that's a very important place to start with the organization. How long does it take us to do things? How fast can we do things? I need to start to know that if I'm going to be agile. So I try to look at it from the financial perspective, because there's a lot of people that are studying speed from an engineering side, from an operations side. They measure it all the time. But the point is, decisions lead to results. So I figured if I could start with the results, can I kind of get a sense of the speed? So there's something called the cash cycle of a business, which says every business has a cash cycle. You borrow money, you make investments, you run your operations, and then you pay back your investors, right? The question is, how long does it take to go through that cycle? So the time you borrow and spend the money, the time you get it back from a customer, how long does that take? And that, in a way, is called speed. I'll give you a simple example financially. Take 2 companies, and these were actually real companies at the time. They have the same profitability. They both make the same margin. But one company does it every 267 days, the other does it every 135. And the question I often ask is, would you rather make 8 cents every 267 days or 8 cents every 135 days? And it should be an obvious answer, but that's the point of speed. Speed is the how often of business. And believe it or not, how often is very important. Don't get me wrong, you got to make money. But if I can make it more frequently, that's more valuable. The latest ranking article that we did, I talked about 2 retail companies in the United States. The point is, there's a company called Costco, which is lower margin. There's a company called Walmart, which is higher margin. They're both discount retailers. But every investor likes Costco because they're more efficient, because they do things faster and they do things more often. And that can win the game over time. And that's what cycle time is about. And so basically, how much times how often is return on invested capital, also is return on capital employed. But they're just 2 drivers of return. And it's just very simple with the language. But I started to measure how often you do things. So here's just a sampling of the 2021 rankings. But we're just on the phone with Nordic Semiconductor. They saw our rankings. They called us. They're like, how did we win? And what's interesting is we were looking with Nordic in Europe as semiconductor. They're a small semiconductor firm that's growing very rapidly. But the way that they're winning is they're doing more with less. Is that they're not doing growth through acquisition. It's mostly organic growth. And they're actually fairly efficient at their production process, so that they're getting a lot of sales relative to their level of investment. And that's actually extraordinarily valuable in the marketplace. And so the point is, when you actually measure their data as a semiconductor firm, they're driving cash to cash, which means from the time they spend the money, the time they get it back, on average in 123 days. And some of their peers are doing it in 200 days, 300 days, 400 days. Broadcom is like 500 days. So the point is, if Broadcom, which is one of the big semiconductor firms, is doing it in 500 days, and my business can turn things in 123 days, I'm basically doing 4 things every time they do 1. And whether it's developing new products, bringing things to market, manufacturing, when I start to see that speed impact, it has a big impact on the business. And I'm telling you that the companies that are doing well are deliberate. One of the companies we highlighted was Nike. And what's interesting is Nike's now competing with itself. They're in a world of their own in retail. And the point is, what they have been doing by investing in digital technology through a series of acquisitions and focusing on their supply chain has given them such a competitive advantage of bringing products to marketplace, but the fact that they also are driving innovation, that there's nobody in the world that's keeping up with them, especially at their size. And that's allowed them, even in a pandemic, to be extraordinarily flexible and do very well. So how do you calculate financial cycle time? We can get into it later. Got some videos on this, but it's investment divided by sales, and then just multiplied by 365, because I think language is important. Final thing I wanted to mention, just limited time, is the other aspect of the Agile dashboard is pivot. And pivot involves know thyself, which means it's a capability, understanding, and knowing the capability of your organization. So there's two simple words I'll use: core and edge. Core is the 80-20 rule of your business. 80% of what you do is your core. 20% of your business is going to be your edge. The point is, whatever your core is, it's going to go away. So if you're not investing in the edge, become your future cores, you're not going to be a sustainable business. So the point is, I'm making these investments. Great. Next part, I need to build capability. So the question is, what is a capability? So what we did is we developed a capability test. And what I want you to do next time you think about a capability is ask yourself these questions. So for example, if I want to go into a new market, I like to use this one. You're Amgen and you make large molecule injectables, basically things that are infused or with a needle jabbed into your arm. And so you're manufacturing your own drugs and you want to start manufacturing pills. Okay, it's called small molecule. So run through a capability test. I'm a large molecule manufacturer. I want to start making pills, right? I'm a pharmaceutical company. How hard could it be to make pills? Question one, do you think the knowledge to make pills are the same as to make injectables? Do you think the people are the same to make pills as injectables? Do you think the technology is the same? Do you think the assets are the same? Do you think the culture is the same? Do you think the process is the same? And if you're honest with yourself, you don't know what you're doing. And that's the problem, is we as organizations are constantly getting ourselves in these things. And one of those dangerous strategic questions you can ask yourself is, how hard can it be? At that point, you're doomed, because it's often harder than you think it is. So it goes back to these 6 things are deliberate, that we need to start asking ourselves, how are we acquiring these capabilities? So I want to do a quick exercise. I want you to think to yourself about your own organization. And I want you to, on a piece of paper, you can do this in person, or you can do this at home at Zoom. And I'd strongly encourage you to do this with your leaders. But to very simply define your core business and define your edge. What's your core? And business today, and what's your edge? What's going to be your core business in 5 to 10 years? What are some of the edge businesses that are important? And believe it or not, this is a harder conversation for most companies than you think. And I know I'm not giving you much time. But the more important and interesting conversation is, what are your capabilities? What are you actually good at? And more importantly, to do those edge businesses, what are you missing? Because when we start thinking about our organization in the future, this gets back to the Agile dashboard. I need to make sure I understand the capabilities, and that's got to be on my dashboard. And how am I understanding what I'm good at and what I need to be good at? So I'll let you take about 5 minutes. We'll know thyself exercise, scribble it out. And then I'm going to ask for maybe 1 or 2 people who might be willing to share. And I'll give you one example while you're writing this down. I'll keep it simple. Talked about Amazon. What do you think Amazon capabilities are? Well, I'll give you 2. Amazon is really good at distribution and supply chain logistics. Another one is AWS. They're really good at data technology and using that to make decisions. So this is why it gets very important. So when Amazon spends a couple $2 billion a year ago to buy a company called PillPack, which is individual prescription drugs packaged, delivered to your home, it completely disrupted the industry. And nobody thought that Amazon wasn't going to pull that off. Because what Amazon does is when they go into new marketplaces, they don't lead with what's the attractive market. What they do is they start with the capabilities. They say, aha, given these capabilities, what markets can we apply them to? And what Bezos has done is he's applied those 2 capabilities to 8 $1 trillion verticals. And has created one of the fastest growing, largest companies in the world, because they stick to their capabilities and they actually manage capabilities at a corporate level. So they don't just manage markets at a corporate level, they manage capabilities at a corporate level. But it also means they got to know what those capabilities are, and they got to know how well they're implementing them. So that's, again, just a different perspective of what I call an Agile dashboard, because we're not just measuring share price. We're not just measuring earnings per share anymore. We got to be comfortable measuring these other metrics. So what are you measuring about your own organization's capabilities? What do you have? What do you need? And what markets are you trying to get into? And can you match that? That's my exercise. We'll go silent for a couple minutes while you write some more things down. And then maybe Rupert can help me moderate. By the way, I'm looking through the chat while you guys are doing this, multitasking. Can't have a Zoom session with dead air. So I see one of the comments is, and I appreciate this, there's a parallel between the role of the CFO and the role of the CHRO in traditional, from traditional transformative. If you want to look at a company that's actually doing that, it's called Stanley Black & Decker. They're a tool company based in the United States. And they actually put a woman in that role. And they basically said, look, we can't just keep people and culture separated from organization transformation. So they actually created an office of transformation, which is a permanent office of transformation. And they put in a person who's in charge of both people and technology in that office. And that's basically a version of what I call capabilities. And they are managing capabilities at the corporate level, and they're putting that in the context of constant transformation throughout the organization. It's a C-suite role. So really interesting how you guys are picking up on this, that the traditional silos are getting more cross-functional as we go into an agile world. So interesting comment I saw in the chat. So companies actually doing that we're working with. All right. Well, again, without giving you too much time, because we're agile.
I'm just wondering, can you hear me, Joe?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, great. So it'd be great to have a volunteer for someone to go through the process. I'm assuming, Joe, that would that be useful?
Yeah. Yes.
Anyone in the room feeling brave? No one's feeling brave. If no one's feeling brave, I'll put myself forward.
Great.
I'm not seeing anyone volunteering. I'll volunteer, Joe. So let's make it a conversation between you and I. Let's get meta on it. So what do you want me to do? Do you want me to describe my business and what's core and edge? And
yeah, just go real quick summary between the four.
So our core business is organization design software that helps people model and design their organization as a system. So understand the work, understand actually the competencies to do that work, understand the outcomes you're trying to achieve dynamically. So you can do, to your point, what if scenarios in the future, and we're doing this at scale. Yep. We are moving, so our edge is advanced analytics. So our data platform is really good for modeling organizations as they are. But the edge, we have another edge tool called TrueCube, and that does time series analysis and what have you, and also simulation, so the ability to do simulation. So that's our edge. Our existing capabilities are OD skills and theories. So we have a group of practitioners, software developers, UX, UI, DevOps, and those kind of capabilities. And what we need to build new is simulation software. So the ability to run simulations based on drivers. And this really applies to the space of workforce planning, because when you do workforce planning, you do bottom up, which is moving nodes around, but also top down. I mean, to your point around planning, and you don't know the outcome, so how can you do different scenarios at speed? So that's new capability that we need to acquire and bring in.
So just for one point, and I appreciate you being volunteering, go a little bit further on why you believe you need a simulation capability. What is a simulation capability?
So a simulation capability is when you're doing workforce planning, you don't know, you're making assumptions around what the future might be. So you're saying how many of X, Y, and Z roles would we need into the future? So you're looking at drivers, and you're looking at flow. So when you're looking at demand and supply of your workforce, on the supply side, people come and go, and so there is risk there around employee attrition. And you make decisions around how many, what's our talent acquisition capability, as an example, and what's the productivity going to be. Now, you don't know how your productivity is going to evolve. You don't know how those roles are going to evolve. So you want to simulate it. And to your point, when you're simulating, you're asking questions, and you're doing, I call it what if analysis as opposed to what now analysis. What now analysis is what's happened now, whereas what if is what could it be. And so it's in planning and designing, it's the ability to simulate that so you can have those, and it's about having those conversations. So how can we have those? Yeah.
Let me stop you right there. And I'm really glad that this is recorded for everybody to watch later, because this is where I think people get tripped up in this conversation about capability. And I appreciate your illustration. The reason I asked the follow-up question is your capability is not simulation. That's the easy part. That's just the asset. Yeah, it's what you're doing with it. It's what you were just talking about. Our ability to do that what if, our ability to drive that uncertainty. In that language is the capability that you're trying to acquire. And that's where organizations, I think, get lost because they just think that I have an asset. I was asking somebody that was, what's your capability? We're good at regulation. And I was like, that's not a capability. Okay. Now I'm not saying that you don't have to be good at regulation, but go beyond that. Like behind that is the actual capability. And that's why I think that language often trips us up in these, because on the one hand, it's tacit knowledge. It is so tacit to you running your own organization about what it is, but it's not necessarily tacit to everybody else. And that's why I like to simplify this in a way that's really understandable. So I appreciate you usually what I like to say to people is, and what I really mean by everything after that is really what you're saying. Just a little good rule of thumb there. And so back to the capabilities, that's the capability you're trying to acquire. Just a really good illustration of that. So again, thank you for being willing to be risky.
Pleasure.
But I know we don't have a lot more time, and I know there's some questions and comments in the chat. How about some just general questions?
I've got one, which actually, before I open it up, I've learned during an MBA what real option pricing is. Mm-hmm. And by education, I'm an economist, so I know what an expected return in NPV is and the difference and why real option pricing's so crucial. However, I think not many do, and it'd be great if you could just expand on that a little bit more, just so everyone can understand it, because you did talk about it, but I think it'd be useful for people to understand why doing an NPV analysis and having expected, net present value or expected cash flow coming through, why that can be flawed and lead to inferior decisions to doing real option pricing where uncertainty is actually the driver.
All right, so now you're going to really test me if I can do this quickly and efficiently. So let's say we're flipping a coin, all right? And basically I'll give you a chance to go double or nothing on heads or tails, right? First problem that we have is that if you flip a coin, double or nothing, there's a 50% probability that you're going to win, double your money. And there's a 50% probability you're going to lose, get nothing. So 50% of 2 is 1 and 50% of 0 is 0. So the expected return of flipping a coin is actually 1. Right? You start with £1 or €1 and you end with £1 or €1. So flipping a coin is a boring game because you just get your money back, right? Except that's the problem, is that if you flip a coin one time, you never get your money back. You either double your money or you get 0. So the first problem that we have that he is highlighting is that when we communicate our targets within the organization, we communicate what we think is going to happen, which is called the expected return. But what we are never going to get is the expected return of the coin flip because we're going to get double or nothing. Well, that's the risk. The risk is the range. And if I don't communicate the range, I don't know what kind of risk I'm taking. Because one person could say, I'm making £1 or €1, and they're flipping a coin. And another person can say, I'm making £1 or €1, and their range is 0.9 to 1.1. Well, if I give you those two ranges, you know that there's different risk profiles of those two investments. But if I don't give you those ranges, and I just tell you we're both going to make £1 or €1, how do you differentiate between those two investments? Second part is, I don't want to flip a coin. Too dangerous in a corporate world. I'm not going to go double or nothing unless I'm a pure startup. So how do I actually do a coin flip in an organization? Well, the answer is flip it 5 times. If you flip a coin 5 times, you're probably not going to lose 5 times in a row. I'm not saying it's mathematically possible, but it could happen. But that's the point about failing fast and failing well, is what companies like Google and the technology companies do is they do 5 coin flips, 10 coin flips. Don't make big bets, make a bunch of small bets. That is more efficient because the more times you flip a coin, guess what you get? Closer to the expected return. So more small bets eliminate risk and get you closer to the expected return mathematically. Then this is the real cool part. Let's say you're flipping a coin and you keep losing. Stop. Right? So this is pharmaceuticals. What they started to realize over time, and this is why they do stage 1, 2, 3, 4 development, is they do stage 1. And guess what? I go to that clinical trial and it doesn't work. It starts killing people. I stop the investment. In a traditional NPV, you keep spending money all the way to the end. In a stage 1 trial where you stop, you don't keep spending money. There's optionality with decisions along the way. See, that's the problem, is we treat everything like a coin flip. Then we're going to just get a coin flip. But if we actually can make decisions along the way to say, aha, when we have failure, we stop. And when we have success, we keep going. The NPV gets much more advantageous. I'm oversimplifying. That's the concept he's referring to as real options. But that's the point. If I can learn along the way about what's successful and then increase my bets on that, and if I can learn along the way what's not successful, learn from that, stop, and repivot, I'm going to do much better than you that just makes the linear one-time investment. And by the way, ask one of your senior leaders to make a coin flip. They're going to struggle on that decision forever because they don't want to lose. Where the people that are making the more small bets, I don't care if I lose a little because I'm going to come back and I'm going to make more. See, that's agile. That's agile thinking. And it's so counterintuitive the way we measure ourselves. And that's why so many of our organizations struggle with this.
That's great, Joe. Karen, yes,
Yeah.
we've got...
Joe, you mentioned at the start that you've jumped in and you're being CFO at the moment. And so I'm intrigued
Yes.
to know what you're learning about applying this in practice. Now, you know, your butt's on the line to deliver this way of working. So what are your lessons learned so far?
Without getting myself into too much trouble, I will say, number one, the importance of culture and people side in these decisions. I can't underestimate how that is getting in the way of making decisions. And what I find myself is I, the CFO, want to move faster than my organization is capable of moving. And that is just a shock, because you would think it'd be the other way around. And everybody is just trying to slow it down and think it through. And I'm just like, going crazy. I'm like, look, I understand finance. I'm not encouraging you to be reckless here, but we have to move faster. So I think it's a respect that sometimes in the outside that we don't understand about how the culture really has a big play in Agile. And some organizations have mastered it. Some organizations have not. But increasingly that gets in the way. So it goes back to the idea that culture eats strategy. Culture eats agility too. And that's been one of my biggest lessons learned with that. The other thing is the fear of failure, is that everyone is so afraid to fail in their organization. And that's the problem, is that ultimately, it comes from poker. I'm a poker player on the side, not as good as I used to be, but I used to be fairly good, just well in some tournaments. And what I started to realize is that you don't measure yourself on whether you win or lose a hand, because probabilities say that every now and then you're going to get a bad outcome. What you measure yourself is, did you make a good decision? Because over the long run, if you keep making good decisions as a poker player and keep making odd, favorable bets, you win a lot of money. And you have to recognize that you're in a marathon, not a sprint. And that's the problem, is everybody wants to make one decision right every time. And you're never going to do that. No one can do that. If you did that, you wouldn't be here. And that's the point, is that we have to embrace that. And that's why I go back to the act at 70%. And as simple as it is for us to say in this room, it is so incredibly hard to do in a real organization. Those are my 2 lessons learned so far.
Cool. Any other questions in the room? Online?
Yeah, we have a question from the chat. You've talked about fail fast culture, but are there any organizations that you have as examples that have managed to make that shift from a rigid culture to a culture of experimentation?
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Right now, I'm working with a couple, and I have to be careful because NDA and stuff, but I will tell you, United Airlines is doing some amazing things. And as an airline, you wouldn't expect that. And part of it was necessity, because believe it or not, and we didn't have too much time to talk about this as well, but back to COVID, a lot of innovation occurs when people have guns to their head, right? When you're on the verge of insolvency, when you have nothing left to lose, it's actually very free. And the airline industry was essentially put in that position, because when you lose 70% of your demand overnight, what are you going to do? And when they were trying to, and it's been a cliche to build back better, but they really are trying to build back better. And they've looked at it as an opportunity to do things that they haven't done ever And they have some amazing things that they're actually trying to do that are extraordinarily customer service focused that they would have never done as a traditional airline because they would have been constrained by the financial quarter that they have to hit with their results that they report to the marketplace. But now that their results are so bad, it's almost like, who cares? Let's just go do the right thing, because we have nothing left to lose. And it's just interesting how so many organizations, for example, and we have this show podcast with Duke called the Agile Dashboard, where I'm interviewing leaders. But one of the repetitive themes of a lot of organizations early in the pandemic is things that used to take us 2 years, we're doing in 2 weeks. And what I like to flip back on them is, why did you always wait so long? Like, what was the impetus? And it was crisis that accelerated things. I'd be interested to find out how we as leaders can accelerate things without crisis. That's what I think separates the really good organizations.
Thank you.
Is there one more?
No, I think we're all right from time.
I think we're up on time. And I want to hear Dave Snowden too, so I want to be fair to his time.
Great. Listen, Joe, that was fantastic. It was great to blend finance and then weave in how people and culture has such a huge impact on your ability to execute at speed and make faster, better decisions. I'm sure everyone learned a lot, and I'm also personally chuffed that we got real option pricing on the table as well. It's great.
Well, thank you, Rupert. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Should we applaud?
Our next guest has already been mentioned multiple times, is Dave Snowden. He's the founder and chief scientific officer at Cognitive Edge. He's been a management consultant researcher for some time, having done machine learning all the way back in 1984 to 1997. Before, I don't think many people were talking about machine learning back then, but Dave was living the dream all the way back in 1984 when the rest of us are trying to catch up now. So that's interesting in its own right. And really looking at how we apply natural sciences to social systems. And I think it's also fair to say, as a Welshman, so he's developed I'm going to get this really, really wrong, Cynefin framework. How am I doing? Terrible. But it means habitat in Welsh. So hopefully I got that right. No further ado, we'll get the pronunciation and the Welsh lessons in a second. Over to you, Dave.
Okay, thanks for that. And sorry I'm not there. I rather foolishly decided to endure what I thought was a broken toe, but turned out to be a bad foot infection. So I've now got it rested up with ice and the miracle of antibiotics. Otherwise, I would have been with you. And ironically, you're actually in the hotel where I attended my first ever management training course. When I first became a consultant, I started off working with the World Council of Churches on the program to combat racism, and worked on things like Indigenous land rights, which actually is very relevant today in some of the stuff. Early career was in HR and then financial management, and then early days of computing. And I moved to a company called DataSolve in Sunbury-on-Thames. And the first thing they did was send us on a 1-week course at the Oakley Court Hotel, which I'm old enough to remember from the Alistair Sims Simpsonians movies, on how to sell double glazing, which of course we were never, ever going to have to do. But it was, to be quite honest, the best training I've ever had in my life. We learned about how to make a cold call, how to do the assumptive close. And I should say, never, ever teach your teenage daughter how to do the assumptive close, because she used it on me one night and said, Dad, is it okay? Can I have my party at home next Saturday or the Saturday afterwards? And before I realized it, I said, oh, the Saturday afterwards. And it's a really good example of the use of the assumptive close. So I was looking forward to being there. But okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm running this in 2 sections effectively. So I'm going to do a sort of 10-15 minute thing on the theory. And then in the second session, I'm going to focus on the practice. And then I'm going to focus on something really important. We published a few months ago, the European Commission's Field Guide on Complexity in Crisis Management, for which I was the principal author. This is somewhat ironically, given the stupidity of the English. Sorry, we are blaming the English for this as we blame them for everything. And we're having to set up a company in Ireland to manage this stuff now, but you know, that's kind of like, okay. So what I'm going to do in the second section is talk about that EU field guide, because that has a series of, it's not just about crisis management, it's about how you manage in conditions of inherent uncertainty. So that's a sort of key principle. So what I want to do in this first section is go through the core theory. I'm going to describe this, yeah. And I probably won't use slides because it's only 15 minutes, all right? But we can send stuff later. So the Cynefin framework, and that's how you pronounce it, it's pronounced Cynefin. Its literal translation into English is habitat or place, but nobody in Wales would use it for anything that trivial. What it means in Welsh is the place of your multiple belongings. It's a sense of being part of a flow of many different things, which you can only ever partially understand, but which make you what you are and what you're going to be. So it's not the same thing as, for example, the German word Heimat, which is a nostalgic return. In Welsh, that's hiriaeth, right? It's this sense that you're in a flow and you have to manage that flow. So you'll find we use a lot of flow dynamics. A good friend of mine, Anne Pendleton-Julian, who wrote probably the best book on design in the last few decades, talks about effectively whitewater rafting or whitewater kayaking. Yeah, as long as you keep moving, you can survive, but if you stop, you can't. So it's got that sort of flow concept about it. The general field that I come from is called naturalizing sense making. That's now recognized as one of 5 distinct schools of sense making. You have Carl Weick, you have Gary Klein, you have Brenda Dervin, and you have a whole bunch of stuff going back into systems thinking. And then you have mine. And I define sense making as how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it. And that has a concept in it of sufficiency. So it's how do I know enough to make a decision in this context? Because I can never know everything I need. And the naturalizing, this is a reference back to philosophy. My first degree is physics and philosophy, by the way, which was an indulgence when I did it, but you know, causes a lot of intolerance these days from a physicist point of view. No social scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion whatsoever. And from a philosopher's perspective, no social scientist ever gets the concepts right. But you know, I'll reference that. I'm in a slightly healthy mood because the antibiotics are cutting in at the moment. Right. So I'll give you an illustration on this. One of the things we know, and this is a famous experiment, if you give radiologists a batch of X-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, on the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. On average, 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. This is called inattentional blindness. The reason you don't is the most anybody from a Western perspective scans of available data is about 5%. If you're Chinese, it goes up to 10%. That seems to be linked to different co-evolutionary pressure on the brain from language types. So you scan 5% on a good day. Most of the time it's 3 or 4%. And then that triggers a series of memories in your body and your brain. It's a mixture of the two. And you blend those together. And the first blend which fits you apply. You do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. Right? Now that's actually quite scary if you think about it. But if you think about it in evolutionary terms, you can see why it happens. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data? Look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look up your company's best practice manual on how to avoid being eaten by lions. By that time, the only document of any use to you will be, or the only one I've ever found, is the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only known case study of how to extract yourself from the digestive tract of a large carnivore. So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan, privilege and our most recent experience. Now that's natural science, and that's what the naturalizing means. Once we know that's the case, any method which assumes you can train people out of that is extremely foolish. It also invalidates most of systems analysis and any process involving consultants interviewing people, because they will only see what they expect to see and they will not see the anomalies. This also explains why after the event, everybody can see a pioneering business idea, but nobody else saw it at the time. Right? So once we get these natural science explanations, we can do a lot more with it. So that's kind of like the cognitive neuroscience. In the second section, I'll come on to the work we do with anthropology. But what I now want to focus on is complexity science. Now, I'm going to make a couple of statements now, which are potentially controversial, but that's never worried me too much. And sooner or later, people will realize they're wrong. All right, it's just a matter of waiting. So the first thing is just to make it clear: complexity science is not a subset of systems thinking. It is radically different. Yeah, and to be quite honest, if I was looking at core competencies, I wouldn't look at systems thinking anymore. There's some interesting methods that we can trace back to, soft systems methodology in Shefflin, but fundamentally the underlying theory is not where we're coming from in natural science. So it's a move on from that. And probably one of the key things is in complexity, we focus on how things connect, not on what they are. And that has a massive implication for the OD community. And I would argue it's ethical to change how people connect, but it's not ethical to try and change what they are. And by the way, the word mindset wouldn't be used by any respectable cognitive neuroscientist. There ain't any such thing, right? It's a sort of mechanical metaphor of the brain, which we can trace back to systems dynamics. So linkages are more important than individuals. We need to think about complexity more than systems thinking. And we also need to think about capability, not competence. Because capability exists in networks, which doesn't exist in individuals. And I'm going to come back to that in the second section. So I think a lot of the sort of sacred cows of OD, which were hugely valuable in their time, don't get me wrong, right? I mean, I work with a lot of them, but we can move on now. And the way I often say it, and I keep having this argument with Gerald Midgley and Michael Jackson, is yes, you address complexity, but we now know the science of it. So, we use gravity extensively as human beings, but after Newton, we saw it differently. Right? So science allows us to scale is kind of like a key principle here. So let's come on to the Cynefin framework. In nature, there are three fundamental types of system. Well, there's four if you include plasma, but that's not so relevant. Ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. And the key thing to understand is that there are phase shift transitions between these. Now, the best metaphor I can think about this is think about solid, liquid, and gas, right? Which is a metaphor for order, complex, and chaos. And I'll develop that. So if I heat up water to 100 degrees, it doesn't immediately become steam. It doesn't become gas. I have to put more heat in first. Yeah, that's called latent heat. My kids used to laugh at me. They're now too old, so they just look at me with scorn. All right, that's what happens as they grow up. All right, is that because I used to go out in the morning and say it's gonna snow. I can smell it. I grew up in the country. I can smell snow coming, and that's not a capability they have because they haven't developed it. But the reason I can do it is a chemical transition as heat is thrown out, as liquid becomes solid. Right? So that's a key metaphor. So an ordered system is one which has such a high level of constraint, that everything in it is predictable and structured. If I've got, say, a solid, a lead weight or something, I put it on the table, it doesn't slip around at all. It's predictable, its boundaries are known. And human beings are really good at creating order, and there's nothing wrong with it. In the UK, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. In Germany, they drive on the right-hand side of the road, and it kind of like makes sense to choose one or the other and go with it, in terms of the way it works. If you work into an operating theatre, and if you look at the structure around the hygiene requirements for cleaning instruments and passing on instruments, that's highly ordered, it's highly constrained, it doesn't allow for any variety. And so there's nothing wrong with order. The problem is there's two other types of system. Right? A chaotic system, and just to be clear, there is no universal agreement on language here. Physicists use it different from social scientists. So I will define my terms, and whether we call it chaos downstream is still an open question. I'm using chaos to describe a system without any effective constraint. So it's de facto random. That means in a human system, it's only ever temporary. Human beings don't like systems without constraint. We introduce constraint very quickly, but when it does happen, it's opportunity and threat. So everything is open, and the old adage is there's nothing so good as a good crisis for innovation. Yeah, innovation increases in wartime and so on. So the breaking of all the connections allows for novelty to emerge. So if we can induce a chaotic state, we can use that for distributed decision making. I'm going to come on to that in the second section. How do you engage the whole of your workforce in real-time decision support rather than consulting them? Right? So there's lots of things we can get when we get that. Because wisdom of crowd works there. I mean, I'll give you the standard examples on that. If you get a group of farmers to guess the weight of a cow at a county fair, then the average of all the farmers' guesses is better than the guess of the best individual. Now, there are three conditions for that to work. One is they must be farmers. Yeah, McKinsey's will sell you a consultancy team to guess the weight of any mammal you want and give you a really good slide set and charge you $500,000, but it won't be as good as a bunch of farmers from Betty-Sequoia, right? So they need to have that tacit knowledge. Secondly, none of the farmers must know what the other farmers have guessed. Because the first guess, and this is a major problem, by the way, the other problem with systems thinking is everything is done in his workshops. And the first person who speaks biases what comes after. You can't prevent that. So that's the bias. And the third one, which everybody forgets, it must be a game. There mustn't be anything at stake, which is why prediction markets have problems. Right? The other one I love is a US submarine which grounded off the coast of Portugal in the 1980s. Nobody knew where it was. Yeah. So they gave partial data to groups of experts around the world, got them all to guess the position. None of them got it right, but a probability distribution of all of the guesses was within 600 meters of the submarine. Now, the reason that works is none of the decision agents are connected with any of the other decision agents. So you see, that's a form of induced chaos. On the other hand, COVID created a temporary state of chaos. And some people, like the New Zealand Prime Minister, did the right thing. I'll come back to that in the next section. Other people, like our Prime Minister, did entirely the wrong things. Right? And I'll go through that as an example. So once you get plunged into chaos accidentally, that initial behavior is absolutely key because it produces the trajectory which follows. And then we get a complex adaptive system. In a complex adaptive system, the best metaphor for this, and this is from Alicia Gerraro, who's one of the good friend and one of the great thinkers here. She once famously said, a complex adaptive system is like bramble bushes in a thicket. Right? And Kurtz and I wrote an article with that title about network density. So I mean, my hobby is going walking, which is why if I get any problem with my feet, I panic, right? All my hobbies are walking and cycling, so the feet are important. And I go walking with two doctors. Now, just to tell you this, my wife said this is good news because they'll look after you, and it isn't, all right? One doctor would be a good idea, and occasionally it's three doctors, which is even worse. If it's more than one doctor, they argue about what's wrong with you, and while you die, they then argue about who was responsible. But one of them, Paul, has this fundamental dislike of paths. So if he's directing the route, we end up going through, the famous phrase is, why don't we just turn right through the heather, which we now dread, right? And you end up in this sort of, small, bunch of, entangled oak leaves and oak trees and bramble bushes, which, okay, you can eat the fruit at the right time of the year, but not much fun. And it's, well, how the hell do we get out of here? I now carry a machete when Paul's leading the route, just in case we need it, right? If you pull one of those bramble bushes, you get an unexpected outcome. Something else changes somewhere else. You can't untangle it. And every small thing, the only thing you can say with certain about a complex adaptive system is anything you do will have unintended consequences. Yeah? So if a complex system is deeply entangled, then the only way you can understand it is by acting. Now here I'll refer back to the last speak, but with an addition. That means you do safe to fail probes to see what's possible. But critically, you do lots of small safe to fail probes in parallel. You don't do one experiment. Because I'll tell you now, if you do one experiment, it will nearly always work. It's called the Hawthorne effect. Anything which is novel, which has attention, will work the first time, but it won't work the second or third time. So this concept, and this, by the way, is a huge conflict resolution device. When I was a C-level executive for a lot of my life, and people come into a room who really understand the subject, and you've got 5 minutes to make a decision. And how the hell do you do it? And you do that 20, 30 times a day. All right, and they're all argument, they're all coherent, they've all studied the subject. What do? You go with the person who was right last time, or the person you trust, or the person you were in a rather obscure club at Oxford University with, to take no real example. So it's a bad decision process. Once you understand complexity, you do a very quick test. Which of these ideas are coherent? Anybody with a coherent idea, here's some resources, run a 3-month experiment, we'll see what works. But we see what happens in parallel, not in sequence. And that will produce contextually appropriate solutions. So there's a whole body of stuff about how we manage in complexity. And I'll come back to one point in 2 seconds. So Cynefin looks at ordered systems, complex systems, chaotic systems. But if you come back to my water metaphor, there's a state of the right balance between pressure and temperature, which is equiprobable whether something can become solid, liquid, or gas. It can go into any of the states. In Cynefin, that is the central domain, which is known as the apparatic domain, and I'll talk about that in the second section. And if you can move into that state, you can choose which of the other domains you go into in whole or part. So that central domain on Cynefin is critical. It can also be called the confused domain. Aporia is a state of deliberate confusion. You confuse yourself deliberately to hold more options open. You don't want to go there accidentally. And then the final bit about Cynefin is it takes order and it breaks it into 2. One where the relationship between cause and effect is self-evident to any reasonable person. In England, you drive on the left. In Germany, they drive on the right. Yeah, and complicated where the knowledge in the expert is correct, but the decision maker may not have that expertise. So it's not self-evident. So you have to do some sort of analysis. So you actually end up within what we call the clear domain, that's part of order, with best practice. In the complicated domain, you have good practice. In the complex domain, you have exactive practice, i.e. you repurpose things you're already good at to something completely new. Reference back to the last speaker there. Yeah. And in the chaotic domain, there's no such thing as practice. You just do what you need to do to get the hell out of it, to be honest, unless you go there deliberately. And the final example I want to give you, and this is kind of like good for everybody, if you really want to understand complexity, go and watch Frozen 2, the movie. Somebody told me this the other day, and I thought, oh God, because my daughter is now 32 years old, an anthropologist working for me, and thinks I don't understand Deleuzian epistemology, and is threatening me with a paper on the subject. This is the same one who did the assumptive close, so I've probably brought her up well. So I haven't got grandchildren yet, so lonely old man, glass of whiskey, watch Frozen 2, and it's actually a very good complexity movie. And there's a wonderful song by Anna in the middle of it, where faced with despair and uncertainty, she sings, do the next right thing. And if you want a simple summary about complexity theory, it's that. It's do the next right thing, then see what you can do next, then see what you can do next. And this is where we have a whole new approach to measurement, is we measure vectors, not outcome. And a vector is measuring intensity of effort, direction of travel, and speed of travel. And that's actually quite important, because if you can't measure outcome, if you can't determine an outcome, a KPI based on outcome will be exactly the wrong thing. But if you can measure direction and speed of travel for energy consumption, that's actually more important. And for every OD practitioner, vector theory of change is probably one of the most important new things coming out of this practice. And I'll talk about that in the second section. So sorry, I went 4 minutes over, but it was the flow.
Thank you so much. It's a lot to absorb. Questions from anyone?
I'm interested in what Joe Perfetti thinks to what Dave Snowden's just said.
Okay, that's a nice question.
Delegation, right?
Joe?
Oh, no, sorry. I've actually been listening very intently. No, I think the reason why we talk about speed, the ability to make decisions, etc. I was really intrigued by his last comment about vectors and how we measure things, because, we tend to, particularly from a financial standpoint, focus on the endpoints. And again, those are often the historical endpoints. I know there's some context there, but when you are looking at the future, measuring that vector part is very, very interesting. I'd love to hear his comments as well about how that applies to a real company.
I'll give an illustration later on, but I mean, I can send you the reference on this later. New Scientist published a meta-study of all studies on human motivation. And it basically came up with a simple conclusion: wherever people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. And the one thing you need under uncertainty is intrinsic motivation. So outcome-based KPIs will actually destroy your company. And I saw this in IBM. People focused on the target, not the thing the target was meant to measure.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that? Because we did a study, so in my previous career, worked in the civil service, and we went through, as you know, politicians go through phases of wanting targets. And we had a decade in the UK where we were target oriented, and we did some review of that, and we found exactly the same. The unintended consequences of focus on the targets, and you can see it in the health service at the moment.
And I blame Tavistock for that. And I tend to blame the Tavistock Institute for a lot, but Tavistock were the people who trained Blair's cabinet, and their focus on outcome-based targets was a large part of the problem. And you notice when Blair got hit on one set of targets, which produced unintended consequences, he created more targets, rather than realizing it was wrong.
But can I link it back to what Mee-Yan was saying earlier? Because I think what we're looking at here is also the competence or the capabilities of OD practitioners. And so I'm curious, Dave, from your point of view, in the work that you're doing, and when we're working in organisations, this sense-making, I mean, is that something that we're just born with? How do we develop it? What's your thoughts on how we as practitioners might step into that space more effectively?
It's actually quite interesting. I mean, I had a formative period in the 70s when I was working on Indigenous land rights in Australia. And I spent a lot of time looking at Indigenous decision methods, which are actually quite interesting. And there are a couple of problems here. In Northern Europe and North America, I'm not going to talk about West and East because it isn't West and East. This is a North America, Northern European phenomenon. There's a focus on talking, then doing. In virtually every other culture, you do and then you talk. And I think that's a problem. It's why I don't like psychodynamics. I don't like Freudian and Jungian approaches, because they come from a very specific culture. They're not universal anyway. They're also very bad science now, and they were good in their time, but we know a lot more about it. But doing then talking, if you look what I talked about on parallel probes, and then see what happens, in terms of the way it works. I think the other thing which is key on this is that there's a huge divide in political philosophy between what's called social atomism and communitarianism. Now, social atomism is Northern Europe, North America. It links in with Boston too. That's where it comes from. It assumes the primary unit of analysis is the individual, and you change systems by changing individuals. The dominant model everywhere else in the world is communitarianism. And by the way, this is also Wales and Scotland and Ireland because we're deeply tribal. And in communitarianism, your primary identity is the community or the clan which you're part of, and you're determined by that. And the interactions within the clan are more important than you as an individual. Now, the cognitive neuroscience is telling us communitarianism is right, social atomism is wrong. Particularly, we now know that consciousness is an extended function. Consciousness is not co-located with the brain. It's distributed into the body and our social interactions. It's more like a cloud capability. So if you want to change things, you can change who people interact with. And I think that's one of the things OD needs to start to do. And you can create things like crews. So in the military, they don't have teams, they have crews. And the same is true in the medical profession. They have crews, not teams. So people are trained in role and role expectation. And the key part of crew design, I do a lot of this work, is you design the interactions between highly ritualized roles. And crews have capacity which is greater than the sum of the parts. And I'd also argue it's ethically case. The minute somebody says, I need to have a culture like X, or I need to create this culture or create this mindset, aside from the fact that you know they can't do it, I'd argue it's ethically wrong. It is not your responsibility to decide what one of your employees should think or do, or their culture or mindset. You can change their interactions, you can set their goals, but who they are is their own bloody problem and their own affair. You might want to provide coaching and nurturing, but actually in terms of organizational design, these days we talk about you design identities and interaction, not individuals and behavioralism. And by the way, we've moved on hugely from behavioral economics now in terms of understanding the way people are motivated.
So Dave, what's your view then on how the pandemic has shifted our interactions in organisations for good or bad?
I'm going to talk about, I can raise it now rather than leave it in the second section. I think it's, yeah, can I do that in the second section? Because I want to set the context for that. Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing your views on learning. So, for example, that seems to me to be something that has fundamentally changed how we can, how we should, and what we should. And so, what are you thinking about how organisations are approaching learning?
I think poorly, all right. I mean, this is where I came from originally in knowledge management. I was decision support knowledge management. And one of the big things we worked out then is that most human knowledge comes through the transference of micro-narratives and clusters of micro-narratives. And I've done a lot of work with engineering companies. The primary learning is done through stories in the field rather than through structured documents, right? So Boassa and I wrote a lot about this, all right? You have highly codified knowledge, which is kind of like maps. You then have highly uncodified knowledge, which is things like London taxi drivers, but that takes a lot of time for them to acquire the knowledge. Narrative is an intermediary. So some of the work we do with military, for example, is called narrative enhanced doctrine. So we're capturing micro-narrative based observations continuously in the field, self-interpreted at the point of the origin by the person who creates them, which is how it scales. And then those get clustered and grouped and linked into text. Because if you have text, and I hot link it into a group of narrative, it makes more sense. I think the other thing is we've got an engine, the thing that systems thinking brought in, which was disastrous. It did a lot of good things, but the disastrous thing was the engineering metaphor. And we're now into an ecological metaphor. And that's that people start to say, what do we need people to do? How do we train them to do it? Now, actually, if I go back to my own education, so age of 11, I go up to grammar school. I was the last of that sort of generation. I'm now allowed to wear long trousers. In the UK, we weren't allowed to wear long trousers until we went to grammar school, which in the winter of '63, with a 3-mile walk to primary school, was pretty dangerous, right? And the first thing we had to do is I walk up to the front of the class and I'm given a record card, and it says, "You support capital punishment." And I had to speak for 7 minutes at the age of 11 without preparation about something I profoundly disagreed with. And I knew the teacher was being vindictive because my mother was leading the Labour Party campaign against that capital punishment at the time. So this was deliberate. We did that every week from the age of 11 to 18. And that made us generalists. And it made us critical because you never knew what you were going to get hit with. So you read everything, you thought about things from different perspectives. We weren't taught to be critical. There was a process which made us critical. And I think that's what we need to start to think about. The process, I mean, the doctors I go walking with don't want to be operated by anybody under the age of 50. Because I say what happened in the NHS is that it used to be you had consultant, houseman, junior doctors as a sort of team. They all knew each other. They trained each other. It was 2 or 3 years. They picked up the pieces. And then the NHS got business process re-engineered, or what Gary Klein calls Six Sigma, right? And anybody who puts lean together with Six Sigma doesn't understand lean, because lean is about eliminating the waste that Six Sigma creates in the first place. And everything became a process. So then people, you're one of these things, so we move you around in the spectrum. So instead of an organic process of learning, you got into this highly structured competence-based model. And the metaphor for that is the engineering metaphor. I need one of these widgets. Yeah, another controversial thing, by the way, things like Myers-Briggs personality test only come in the 80s. They're actually established as a pseudoscience. There is no scientific basis whatsoever for Myers-Briggs. Yeah, all the literature, it's a pseudoscience. But it allows HR departments to put people into little boxes like widgets in an engineering system. Yeah, and I think, again, that's that sort of counter-learning concept.
Yeah. We have a question asked by Richard on the chat. You describe about how some of the science has moved on this area, but organisational practice hasn't. So practically, where do you start when there's so many flaws in organisation design?
I mean, one of the other complexity principles is you start from where people are, not from where you would want them to be. So one of the big things I've always opposed in consultancy is where the consultants get senior executives together and they all agree where they want to be in 1 or 2 years' time, and they try and close the gap. In complexity, you describe the present and then create a trajectory or trajectories forward. So you have to map where people are. My general advice is start with the intractable problem. So a lot of my OD work, for example, we start by producing narrative-based culture maps. Yeah, culture is an intractable problem in every organization. People have been trying to engineer or manage culture for 4 decades. They haven't succeeded. So something a little bit different they're prepared to look at. So giving the example, the way we do an initial map is we go to every employee and we say, what story would you ask your best friend if they were offered a job in your workplace? Yeah? And then we ask them to interpret that story into a series of geometric shapes. These days we use symbols. The whole principle is nobody can gain what the outcome is. They don't know what answer you want. This is called abductive research if you want to do the academic side. And from that, we draw what are called fitness landscapes, which are like contour maps, which show dominant cultures, outlier cultures, subsidiary cultures, and overlaps. And you can click on the map and read the stories. And remember, that question is a non-hypothesis one. All right, so that ability to then, and then you can do the vector stuff. How can we create more stories like these, fewer stories like that? So you do something based on an intractable problem and get people engaged in a different way of working.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully that offers some organisations or HR that are trying to support cultural shifts some advice. Another question, what do you think has replaced behavioural economics?
Well, it hasn't yet. That's part of the problem, all right? I mean, it's quite interesting. If you go back to the original nudge stuff and you look at Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, which is one of those really depressing books. I mean, it uses a huge bunch of material which was non-replicated, which is bad science. Secondly, we already knew the phenomenon. It's called autonomic novelty receptive processing. It's just that economists never bother to walk across the corridor to their cognitive neuroscience colleagues because they might discover they don't need to do 10 years of research. But okay, you get a Nobel Prize, right? And don't talk about the latest book, right? So I think, that sort of concept, it's a very instrumentalist approach. There's a really good book worth reading called Neuroliberalism from colleagues of mine at Aberystwyth University. Because they understand that behavior has a role in human dynamics. And what we do with those culture maps is we say more stories like this, fewer stories like that. That's a type of nudge. If I go to nurses, for example, and say, how do you become more patient-centric? Or I say, well, the nurses in the next ward have better patient centricity, which is the nudge approach. That's going to get hostile responses. We got these patient stories. We've been doing this in Northern Ireland for 10 years now, continuous capture of patient stories. How would you create more patient stories like these and fewer like those? So that's self-nudging. No? And the point about the neuroliberalism book, it basically says the nudge unit in Downing Street and the like, they've subordinated behavioral science to the needs of neoliberal economics. And that's the criticism. It's a really good book because it's positive about behavior and negative about manipulative use of behavioral science.
Thank you. I think we're ready for the second section.
Right. Probably move on to the next section.
Okay, so I'll do this in less time because I overran on the previous one. I feel like I owe you this, right? So about a year and a half ago, I was working with the European Union, the Future Systems Directorate, and they adopted Cynefin as a basic framework to understand complexity in government across Europe. Yeah, and they've got a whole unit based on that, the design unit. So when COVID hit, we kind of like got together and produced a field guide. And for anybody interested, we are actually going to launch an assessment process for this in a few weeks' time, and also producing an OD specific version of the field guide. Yeah, what the HR departments do in terms of assessment. But basically, the field guide looks at a crisis, and it looks as 4 basic stages. Yeah, assess, adapt, exact, transcend. All right, so I'll run through those, and then I'll talk through some of the core interventions because they have a huge implication for OD. So if you hit a crisis, and that's what COVID hit, nobody knew what the hell was going on, everything was all over the place. There's a key principle of complexity-based leadership, and I'll outline this now. The higher up you go in an organization, the fewer decisions you actually make. Right? And the more angry customers you meet. That's the downside, right? The principle is centralized coordination, distribute decision making. Yeah, your role as a leader is to coordinate and link and connect. You haven't got the time or the energy to make all the detailed decisions. Not only that, in a crisis, you'll get a lot of them wrong, and then your credibility is shot. Yeah, so that will remove your ability to lead. The only exception to this is when the crisis starts. And there you have to impose draconian constraints to give yourself more options. Coming back to Joe's point, options are key. Yeah. Now, what Alicia did in New Zealand, and I think New Zealand are currently planning to export prime ministers to the rest of the world as a new export to go with lamb, right? Is she broke the law to lock down. Her own Supreme Court overrode her. They didn't accuse her of corruption. They just basically said you didn't have the power to do this. But that gave her more options. She made that decision very quickly. UK, US, Sweden waited until they had no choice. So when they made that choice, the options were closed down and the damages were there. And that's actually a good illustration. Yeah, then you have to, and I'm not going to go through the field guide in principle, but I just want to pick out a couple of things. The XAP stage is key. So this is a thing from evolutionary biology. The example I like is a dinosaur's feathers. So if you don't know it, and this gives you one over young kids because the kids' textbooks haven't caught up to date, all dinosaurs had feathers and they were very colorful. So all those pictures of gray, scaly, that's not what happened, right? They all had feathers. We know this from northern China now. And they evolved for warmth and sexual display. And then one breed of dinosaurs developed a sort of skin flap under their forelimb to better display their feathers. And they were small and fast running to escape predators. And one day they sort of ran a bit too fast and glided. And that's how we got flight. So a trait which evolved for one function under conditions of stress, it didn't adapt, it exapted for something different. Yeah. The cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved in apes to manipulate muscles in fingers. It exapts in humans to manage grammar in human language. Grammar is too big a step for a linear evolutionary process. It requires a non-linear exaptation process. Same is true in technology. So in 1945, a Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto of a radar machine noticed a chocolate bar melted in his pocket. Now, this has happened to lots of people and they just swore and got their trousers cleaned. He realized the significance and put a metal box around the magneto and we got microwave ovens. Yeah, a decade or so ago, a scientist happened to mention a rather embarrassing side effect of a cardiac drug and it gave Pfizer their best-selling ever drug of all time. IBM were the world's market leaders in punch card controller sewing machines and they repurposed it to dominate the computer industry for 5 decades. Yeah, that's called exaptation. Yeah, so it's the ability to rapidly repurpose what you already know for something completely different. And that's a key skill for what we'll call resilience. Yeah. So there are 3 core functions within the U Field Guide, which actually are OD specific. Yeah. First of all, is you naturally need to engage the whole of your workforce in real-time decision support. Now, I mentioned that earlier. We're now doing this in several organizations. We're currently working on the post-conflict resolution in the States after the election. And what we're doing there is what's called citizen ethnography. So basically, all employers become ethnographers. You then describe the situation to everybody, and they interpret it in real time, and you look at the maps that come back. Now, we call this finding the 17%. Remember that metaphor of a contour map? It means that the 17% of your employees who are seeing the world differently become visible to you as a leader. And in a crisis, you can't afford to wait days for feedback. You need real-time feedback. We're currently in advanced conversations on this in Europe because we've done work, for example, to make school children as ethnographers. I remember trying to get help and to take this seriously in Downing Street, because I said we could roll this out across the whole of the UK and we could gather narratives continuously. It would be a great program, and you could see when people are ready to be nudged. But his view was nudging is what the government want me to do. So we're now looking at that generally across Europe as part of a school curriculum, because then I can actually get feedback from my citizens through young people in real time to measure, for example, attitudes to lockdown and so on. But the same is true of employees. So it gives you this cognitively, culturally diverse feedback mechanism. And that's called a human sensor network. They can be set up, they can be run very quickly. They're quite easy to do, they're app-based. Second thing is you need to map what you know, but you need to map it at the right level of granularity. Because for things, and this is Brian Arthur's work and Robin Oakley Smee's work and my work and other people, things exapt at the optimal level of granularity. Too big, you can't recombine them. Too small, they're too scattered. So it's the magneto, not the radar machine. And again, there's a whole process by which you can map knowledge through decisions and maintain a dynamic knowledge map, which is actually not structured into taxonomies. Taxonomies are the death of innovation. Yeah? They not only rhyme with taxonomy, but they produce the same results. Yeah? And then the third thing, and probably the most critical, I've done 70, 80 interviews now with senior executives in government and industry worldwide alike. The thing which worked best for them in a crisis was their informal networks, not the formal processes. Yeah, it was actually informal networks, and we know the theory on this. An informal network is a content-free channel. Yeah, so you don't structure the channel based on the content. The content is constructed in context and flows very, very quickly. And of course, informal networks are based on trust. Now, the problem is if your informal networks are based on who you went to school with or who you joined a company with, they're very restricted. So there's a whole method around this called entangled trios, which is, by the way, also a new form of organization. And it's also a new form of stress relief in which we aim within 9 months to have everybody within 3 phone calls of everybody else based on have worked on a micro project together. Now, the metaphor for this is, if you don't know this one, is health of plants. That, for example, trees in the field is entirely dependent on the fungal roots that connect the tree roots. It's a symbiosis. So an organization without a dense informal network is actually very unhealthy. All right, and the trouble is, at the moment, and we know this in government, you know, I don't blame people for making decisions based on the old boys network, because actually you haven't got time to do anything else. So what we need to do is to create those networks cross-silo to actually create capability. And by the way, we're now experimenting with organizational forms on this, in which you get rid of a CEO and you get rid of a COO and you entangle people. So you manage by coordination, yeah, and connection. You don't manage by direction. So there's some really interesting stuff coming out on this, if anybody's interested in that. But creating informal networks is key. And that's all about creating an organization which is resilient, not robust. Now, just to be clear, in case anybody says it, I'm one of a very large number of people, including 3 Nobel Prize winners, who have been blocked by the Taleb, right? So Taleb doesn't like this, right? Being blocked by the Taleb is a distinction. I see anti-fragile as a subset of resilience and actually not the most effective. If things only can survive by breaking, that's quite dangerous. Yeah. So the metaphor I use, and I would use this for an organization as well, is a robust system is a seawall, a resilient system is a salt marsh. And if anybody's been watching the news in the UK this morning, you'll see one of the news items has been a point on the Gower Peninsula in Wales where a seawall broke and they decided to let the salt marsh develop. Now, the point is, when a seawall breaks, the results are catastrophic. When a salt marsh is saturated, it doesn't release the stored water. And it's constantly changing and constantly adapting. So by building dense informal networks, by storing knowledge so it can flow quickly in novel contexts, and by mass engagement of the workforce, effectively communication by engagement, you build an organization, this is the third characteristic, which is able to handle as yet unanticipated threats and opportunities. And this is where you stop the retrospective coherence, which dominates every single management textbook. Everybody wants to look at past cases and derive general theory from those. What we do is we say, what does the natural science say? And we derive practice from the theory, not theory from the practice. And that avoids the confusion of correlation with causation. So one final thing to leave you on that, if any country present in the group wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes it wins per year, all you have to do is increase dark chocolate consumption. Because dark chocolate consumption directly correlates per head of population with Nobel Prizes per head of population for the last 3 decades. It's a huge data set compared with anything that any social scientist ever has. So I've given you a wonderful solution. Yeah. The other one, which is often used, which I think is probably a causal link, is that drownings by suicide directly correlate with the release of Nicolas Cage movies. But I can see a causal link in that one. Right? We need to start to create a theory-informed practice rather than always looking for cases of past practice. And if it was always the case anyway, post-COVID, it's even more critical.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Just on with forming informal networks, in the world of post-COVID and this hybrid world that we all seem to be moving towards, where people are working more and more in functional silos, what practical advice could you give to help address that?
I think we're moving to a hybrid organization. I mean, I had my first meeting the other day in Bristol with the team. We got more done in 3 hours as a team than we'd done over any number of Zoom conversations. So I think it's that phrase, horses for courses. Yeah. You need a hybrid organization. We're also getting the modern phenomenon. You know, there was a famous episode of Friends where Rachel takes her smoking because it's the only way she'll be part of the key group which makes all the decisions. Yeah. So there's another danger on remote working is that you don't get involved in that decision process. Yeah. But equally, it's a transformation the way we deal with disabled employment. Right. So this is a huge opportunity if we do it right. So the way we're designing trios, for example, is linking and connecting people on both hybrid and non-hybrid working. So lots of and I'll give you a university example because not the industrial one, because it's easier to understand. When somebody joins a university, let's suppose you're doing the humanities, you'll go put in a trio, and we always do 3. Right? Reason is if 2 people go out for dinner, it's stress. If 3 people go out for dinner, it's not stress. Yeah, because and then 3 is an important number. So you put in a trio with somebody from pure sciences and somebody from engineering, and you're given tasks to run every month. That's part of what you do. And what we're doing is we're integrating across silos without destroying the silos. So we're creating channels by which things can communicate. And by the way, we now use that in California to actually create cross-silo knowledge capability, because students can often find things that our senior academics won't. So this has multiple functions. So that's what you do in an organization. It's called Entangled Trios. Our methods are in an open source wiki. Yeah. And what you do is you start to entangle the organization between roles very quickly. And that also gives you the early weak signal detection. And by the way, we also use this on mental health. But the big problem we're all going to have over the next year is the mental health plague. Yeah, we got how are we going to survive, how the health service is going to survive the number of resignations it's about to get, I don't know. It's a real worry, right? So if we can increase cross-silo network density, we can reduce the pressure on mental health on the system as a whole. Tightly connected, if families and clans have fewer mental health problems than isolated individuals. So we're replicating that in terms of the way it works. And there's a general principle here: nearly everything you do in complexity has multiple outcomes. Is what you're doing is you're changing the ecosystem and you're open to emergence. So the things you manage in complexity are identity, interaction, and what's called scaffolding, your overall structure. Yeah. And after that, you monitor fast and you reinforce the good stuff and disrupt the bad stuff.
So Dave, just coming back to something you were talking about earlier, the differentiation between individuals and community and the focus on community. So one of the things that we're seeing emerge is post-pandemic, is that more that sort of focus on local community, and different sets of networks, and some of the experiments that we're seeing in terms of ways of working is how we start to build up place-based communities which cut across organisations. Is that potential opportunity emerging from the pandemic to reset?
Yeah, and I think it's actually very important. I mean, I live in a small village in Wiltshire, right? And one of the, we've now got a bakery in somebody's garage, which produces wonderful sourdough bread and pizza, and the goat farm up the road provides milk. So communities are becoming more interdependent. And actually what's interesting is, even though we're isolated in the pandemic, we all know each other more. Yeah, so the parties on the street where you can't come close to each other, but you're all having a gin and tonic. Yeah, so that sort of connectivity is key. All right. Now we know that. I mean, and this, if you don't know Robin Dunbar's work, it's worth looking at, right? So Dunbar's numbers are quite critical. So, for example, we know once a society goes above about 5 million, it loses cultural cohesion. Yeah. Is that?
Sorry.
Sorry.
I had a question for you, Dave.
Okay,
from the online chat, which builds on this topic of informal networks. How do you avoid things like groupthink? How do you create a diverse community or network? And how do you avoid bias, but without that community or that informal network becoming too formal?
Well, first of all, if people try and make it formal, it won't work anymore. I mean, I did the original work on this on IBM 30 years ago. The ratio between formal and informal was 1 to 64. And that was only the virtual, the use of virtual environments. So it was probably bigger than that. And I still remember going to IBM's chief knowledge officer, and she said, okay, so how do I make these formal? And I said, well, you can't. And all that will happen is they'll go off-site. So people have this need for this natural communication. The way we structure it, we've got 2 or 3 methods, but the way entangled trios work is you put people together in a pair. So for example, I'll take an example from work we're doing in Florida. So you identify all the roles within a system. So we got community nurse, community police officer, teacher, whatever, right? You identify pairs between that. Yeah. And then you allow the pair, and the pairs are logical, but then they can choose any other roles as their 3. So you put the variety in that way. Then they have tasks to perform as a trio. We record that in narrative form. After 3 months, you redig the trios again. So you're constantly flexing the trios so that the system becomes more and more entangled. And you're entirely focused on the way that the roles are connected, because the reason we use roles is that's the formal system can pick up weak signals in the informal system, right, as it's working. So that's the way. You can't avoid bias completely, but what you're doing by multiple parallel activity is radically reduce it. Yeah. And the thing people don't get on this, and it's key, is you're changing the dynamics of the system and allowing things to emerge. You're not designing what you want. You're designing something which is more likely to evolve in something that you might find desirable. And that's a real switch of thinking for people.
Dave.
So, thank you so much. There's so much to think from all 3 sessions, actually. And I think I've got about 10 pages of notes. Now I have to try and summarize that in 3 minutes. so I'm just going to let it emerge and try and deal with the complexity and not have it be overly complicated in my mind. What I think we started off with was, how do we take a body of knowledge in OD and codify that? And how do we create a system of competencies and best practice and say, this is what mastery is? In a domain of systems thinking where chaos can lead to phenomenal breakthroughs, and informal networks have power to disrupt and create new opportunities like the microwave or the post-it note. So there's a sense of sort of contradictions in a way, but I kind of reflect a little bit when we said, well, how do we make, from Mee-Yan's piece, practical? Was let the individual do their own self-assessment against the Chinese smorgasbord of options, and maybe just letting it emerge through informal networks rather than trying to push through the formal, and think about how Wikipedia has done what it's done. It's just kind of one thought that's jumping in my mind, but also there's a contradiction, and people in business want certainty. They want outcomes. They want, this is our expected free cash flow that we're going to generate, and that can lead to really, really bad financial decisions, but also mean that you're not going to move fast enough. And I think there's probably a challenge for this community to help probably most CFOs, because I don't think most CFOs understand real option thinking and complexity and informal networks, because you can't quantify it. So how do we help people to understand that you can evolve in these informal networks, and complexity and understanding probability is actually rational, because it leads to these outcomes. So, and then, building back, and that's system, maybe it's not systems thinking, maybe I think I need to go on another education course here as well, and I've got a lot to learn. And how we can use uncertainty to develop these options, and that the value of uncertainty is tremendous. And that's where entrepreneurs thrive, is in that. But another point that I took away from this is that you have to constrain it. You can only survive for so long. Did I get that right, Dave? At least I hope I did. I hope I've been listening.